The morning began with impossible things. Elelina Ashworth had seen snow before. Of course she had. Growing up in Lancashire meant winter arrived like an old acquaintance. Familiar grey skies, cold pavements, breath turning to mist, and the quiet little crunch of frost underfoot on the walk to school. Snow was normal. What wasn't normal was watching it drift upward. Outside the leaky cauldron, flakes rose in slow, delicate spirals, as if they'd forgotten gravity, then softened and turned, letting themselves fall again in gentle loops. A few clung to the window and arranged themselves into tiny figures. Nothing sharp or alarming, just the suggestion of dancers, made from white dust spinning in place before dissolving into sparkles and becoming plain snow once more. Ella stood very still, as though any sudden movement might break the fragile logic holding the scene together. The air should have been bitter, but it wasn't. December hovered around them with a strange kindness. Cool enough to feel real, warm enough to keep fear from taking root. "Stay close now," her mother said. Margaret Ashworth's hand tightened around Eleanor's, too tight for comfort, as if she could keep her daughter safe by refusing to let go. Her knuckles were pale against Eleanor's skin. There was a tremor in her grip, excitement tangled with worry, and neither one willing to give way. Lilina's father walked half a step behind. Robert Ashworth had the careful posture of a man stepping onto ice that might crack, his attention skimming the walls and corners as though the building might decide it had had enough of them and fold itself out of existence. In one hand, he kept a leather satchel close to his side. Inside it was everything they had saved, 11 years of careful planning, of small sacrifices and quiet budgeting, now exchanged into unfamiliar coins that felt oddly warm when he'd opened the pouch to check them. Aliena had watched him do it earlier, with the same baffled reverence he usually reserved for things he couldn't fix or explain. He was a practical man. He liked answers that could be drawn in a straight line. Today, nothing was straight. A kindly witch waited for them in the courtyard behind the pub. Mrs. Petton was not tall, and she wasn't dramatic, and somehow that made her even more reassuring. She had silver hair pinned neatly back, half-moon spectacles that caught the light, and robes the color of autumn leaves. She carried herself with the patient calm of someone who had guided many families through the same doorway between worlds. "This way, if you please," she said gently, and gestured to a brick wall that looked stubbornly ordinary. Elelina had stared at it when they first arrived, half expecting something obvious, an arch, a sign, a secret handle. There was nothing. Just bricks, damp with winter air, as plain as the side of any London building. Mrs. Petton drew a slender piece of wood from her sleeve, a wand. Elenina's throat tightened at the sight. It was only a wand, just wood, just a shape, but it carried a sense of certainty she couldn't explain, like a key held with confidence. Mrs. Petton tapped the bricks in a pattern. 3 up, 2 across, and the wall moved. It didn't swing open like a door. It didn't slide away like a panel. The bricks themselves loosened and rearranged with a quiet, steady purpose, folding and turning as if they were parts of a puzzle that had finally been told where to go. An archway formed, widening into a passage, and beyond it lay a street that had no business existing anywhere in the world. Elelena had known yesterday. "Welcome, Mrs. Worth," Piton said softly, "to Diagon Alley." Elelena stepped through. The first thing she noticed was the sound. Not loud, not harsh, but layered. Voices called from shop fronts with the easy rhythm of daily life, but underneath ran other sounds, the soft rustle of owl wings above the chimneys, the chime of bells that rang without wind, the distant hoot of something that might have been a horn, or might have been alive. Someone laughed nearby, and it wasn't ordinary laughter either. It felt as though joy itself had been tucked into it, as though happiness had been encouraged to travel further than it had any right to. The second thing was the scent: cinnamon and old parchment, wood smoke and polished brass. Something sweet and hard to name, like summer fruit remembered in winter. A clean greenness, like crushed grass, impossibly out of place in December. And beneath it all, sharp and electric, a note like lightning, alive, immediate, as though the air here carried its own quiet power. The third thing was the snow. It fell the way snow fell nowhere else. Each flake seemed to make a choice about how it moved. Some drifted in tight corkscrews, others looped lazily as if enjoying the descent. When they landed on the dark cobblestones, they didn't melt. They didn't even settle. They vanished in tiny sparks of light, as though they'd been borrowed from the sky only for a moment, and then returned. "Oh," Margaret whispered. It was only one syllable, but it held every childhood wish she'd never allowed herself to say out loud. Diagon Alley stretched ahead, winding into a winter haze. Buildings leaned close together with cheerful disregard for physics. Tudor beams pressed up against Georgian stone, which somehow connected to arches that looked ancient enough to have seen empires rise and fall. Everything stood with a slightly crooked confidence, as though the whole street had been built by people who valued charm over sense and had never once apologized for it. Shop signs hung where they pleased, some attached to brackets, others hovering in open air with no visible support. A cauldrons sign rotated slowly, puffing steam that smelled faintly of cloves. A golden mortar and pestle ground, invisible ingredients, as if determined to be useful. A broomstick in a window display zoomed in small, impatient circles, like a puppy that had been told to wait. People moved through it all, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Witches in cloaks of deep purple and forest green. Wizards in robes that brushed the ground without picking up snow. A woman passed carrying a basket of flowers that hummed softly, their petals shifting colors like sunset. A man hurried by, with an owl perched on each shoulder, both birds gripping parcels wrapped in brown paper and string that glowed faintly, as though the packages were warm with whatever lay inside. Elena stayed close to her parents, but her eyes kept drifting. Up to the signs, down to the cobbles, across to the windows where objects moved with quiet confidence. She was trying to hold the whole street in her mind at once, afraid that if she blinked too long it would all slip away. "The large white building ahead," Mrs. Cook Peton said, guiding them forward. "That's Gringotts, the Wizarding Bank. We'll exchange your pounds for galleons, sickles, and knuts." Elena craned her neck as they approached. Gringotts stood taller than everything else, its white marble facade gleaming against the bruised winter sky. The doors, bronze and heavy, were open, and above them words were engraved, sharp and formal. Elena tried to read them all, but the meaning tangled in her mind. One phrase stood out, clear as a warning. "Take heed." Flanking the entrance stood small figures with long fingers and clever dark eyes. Their faces were narrow, their attention precise, as though they measured everything they saw. "Goblins," her father murmured, not quite to anyone, as if saying the word might make it easier to accept. Reading about goblins in a letter was one thing. Seeing them watching you from either side of a bank door was another. One goblin inclined his head as they passed, a gesture so exact it felt like a rule. Eliana found herself copying it instinctively. For the briefest moment, something flickered in the goblin's expression. An acknowledgement, perhaps, or mild approval, before it vanished into professionalism. Inside, Gringotts was all cold grandeur. The hall stretched longer than it should have been, lined with goblins seated on high stools behind a counter that ran the length of the room. They worked quickly, counting coins, examining gemstones through jewelers' lenses, writing in enormous ledgers with quills that moved so fast the tips blurred. The ceiling disappeared into shadow. Chandeliers hung suspended as if the air itself held them up. Their light was clear and pale, and the marble floor reflected it all, creating a mirror world beneath their feet. Alalina felt very small, and not in a bad way, more like a person standing in a place that had existed for centuries and didn't particularly need her to make sense of it. "Next," called a goblin at the nearest station, voice crisp as frost. Mrs. Peton handled everything with calm familiarity, translating the goblin's efficient questions into language Elena's parents could answer without stumbling. Robert produced the satchel and opened it, revealing a neat stack of carefully saved notes. Even here, in a room full of magic, money still had weight, still represented time. The goblin took the notes with long fingers and examined them briefly, not with suspicion, but with an exactness that suggested he found error unacceptable. Then, with a few swift movements and the clink of metal, he replaced Elena's family's ordinary currency with coins that looked too bright to belong to any familiar world. A leather pouch appeared on the counter, heavy with sound. 17 galleons, the goblin said, dropping large gold coins into the pouch with a firm clink. 43 sickles. Silver followed, and 18 knuts. Small bronze coins completed the count. "Will there be anything else?" "No, thank you," Robert Ashworth managed, voice steady, eyes wide, with the kind of wonder he was trying very hard to hide. The goblin nodded and immediately turned to the next customer, as if Elena's entire transformation from ordinary life to magic had been nothing more than a routine transaction. Outside again, the snowfall had thickened. Elena held out her hand, and a few flakes landed on her palm. They sat there for a moment, glowing faintly as if lit from within. She couldn't have sworn to it under oath, but she felt as though they were trying to speak. Soft, secret, the way a name feels when someone says it kindly. "Elanina, love, don't wander," her mother called, but there was less panic in her voice now. Something about Diagon Alley, despite its strangeness, felt steady. Not because it was predictable, but because it was lived in. This wasn't a performance put on for them. This was a real place, full of people who had lives and errands and favorite shops. Witches and wizards passed with friendly curiosity rather than suspicion. A wizard in peacock blue robes tipped his hat to Margaret, polite and unbothered. 2 teenage witches, Hogwarts students perhaps, home for the holidays, giggled as they hurried by, arms linked, faces bright with shared secrets. Elena walked slowly, letting her gaze skim from window to window. In one shop, display broomsticks were arranged in a flying V, swooping and diving in a graceful pattern behind glass. In another, books stacked themselves into new towers and then unstacked again, as if the shop couldn't decide what shape it liked best. From an owl emporium came soft hoots and the whisper of feathers, and then, ahead, color. A shopfront that glowed red and gold like a captured sunset, bright even against the grey winter day. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Elanina stopped without meaning to. In the window, enchanted snow creatures performed a playful chase. An owl made of ice crystals swooped past a rabbit made entirely of snowflakes, both leaving sparkling trails in the air before dissolving and reforming again. Bottles of potion pulsed softly with pink light. Small, fluffy creatures rolled across a display, squeaking and bumping into one another like living pom-poms. A banner hung across the front, with a joke written in large, cheerful letters. Her father made a startled, choking sound that might have been laughter trying to pretend it wasn't. "The Weasley twins," Mrs. Peyton said, tone half exasperated, half fond. "They opened this shop a few years back. brilliant, really. Their mother would likely say otherwise. Can we go in? Elena asked, unable to hide the hope in her voice. Her mother hesitated, then smiled, properly smiled, as if the day had finally made room for delight without fear pressing in behind it. Later, Margaret said, we should follow the list. Books, robes, cauldron. Elena nodded, though she still stared at the window, at the bright insistence of it. Even from outside, she could feel something about the place, a deliberate decision to be colorful, to be silly, to be warm. They moved on, the snow falling steadily, the street unfolding in front of them like a story that had been waiting for her to arrive. They walked on through the snowfall, as if through a painting that kept deciding to become more real. Alalina stayed between her parents, her mother on one side and her father on the other, the three of them moving at the careful pace of people who didn't yet trust the ground to remain the same beneath their feet. The cobblestones shone black under the shifting white, always clear where people needed to walk, as though the street itself quietly looked after its own. Right, her father said, very softly, as if speaking too loudly might unsettle something important. He pulled the parchment list from his pocket again, though they'd already read it enough times that the folds were beginning to soften at the creases. Books, books, robes, cauldron, and a wand. He said the last word with a small hesitation, and Elelina felt her chest tighten in answer. Not fear exactly, but the shape of anticipation. It seemed absurd to feel nervous about an object, but everything about today had made her understand that objects in this world weren't only objects. They carried stories. They waited. They chose. Her mother leaned closer, reading the list again, as if the ink might change. Madame Melkins for robes, Margaret murmured, and Flourish and Blotts for textbooks. Elena watched her mother's face as she said the names. Margaret was trying very hard to do what she always did when she was worried. Turn it into something manageable. A sequence. A plan. A list that could be ticked off. One item at a time. But every time her eyes lifted from the parchment to take in the street again, wonder softened her features. And for a moment she looked less like an anxious parent and more like someone remembering how it felt to be young. A shop window displayed glittering brass instruments that looked like telescopes but were longer and stranger, their ends carved with intricate patterns. Another displayed clocks that did not simply tell time. One showed phases of the moon, another seemed to track the movement of tides, and one, very small, had a single hand that drifted lazily between words Elena couldn't read from where she stood. As they passed, she noticed that people glanced at them, not with alarm, not with suspicion, but with the mild interest you might give to someone new in a familiar place. A few smiles, one nod. A witch with a basket of winter herbs said, "First time?" with the gentle certainty of someone who already knew the answer. Elenina's mother managed a polite smile in return. "It's all right," her father murmured to Elenina, though she hadn't said anything. "You look as if you're trying to memorize it." "I am," she admitted. He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Good. If it's real, it deserves to be remembered properly." They found Madame Malkin's at the turn of a slightly narrower stretch of street, where the buildings leaned closer and the snow seemed to drift in slower spirals, as though it, too, was lingering to look. The shop front was neat and welcoming, a warm window filled with mannequins, dressed in plain black robes that somehow looked elegant rather than severe. A sign swung gently above the door, Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of lavender and clean cloth. Eleanor took a slow breath as they stepped in and felt something settle in her. Not because the shop was less magical, because it was still magic, still impossible, but because it was the kind of magic that resembled something she could understand: fabric. measurements. Someone whose job was simply to make sure things fit. A witch behind the counter looked up and smiled as though she'd been expecting them. "First years?" Madame Malkin asked, cheerful and brisk. She had a tape measure draped around her neck that shifted slightly, as if eager to be useful. "Yes," Margaret said, and then seemed to catch herself. "Yes, our daughter she's going to Hogwarts. Well then, we'll have you sorted in no time," Madame Malkin said, as if Hogwarts was only a slightly more unusual version of secondary school and children arrived every week for uniforms, which Elena realized was probably true. The magical world had its own rhythms. The surprise belonged to her, not to the people who lived here. Elenina was guided onto a small footstool in front of a tall mirror. It reflected her in her ordinary winter clothes, jeans, a thick jumper, a scarf, except the reflection seemed brighter somehow in the shop's light, her cheeks pink from the cold, and her eyes too wide with it all. The tape measure lifted itself without being touched and began to work. It measured from shoulder to wrist, from neck to ankle, around her waist, the curve of her hips, the length of her arms when she stretched them out. It moved quickly but gently, never tugging, never snapping. There was something oddly comforting about it, like being measured by a creature that took its task seriously and wanted to do it well. Elenina tried not to flinch. Each time it slid past her skin, the sensation more like a cool whisper than a touch. "Hold still, dear," Madame Malkin said, though her voice was kind, not stern. "Yes, that's it. Arms out. Lovely." Beside Elena, her parents hovered like anxious satellites. Her mother kept her hands clasped so tightly, Elena wondered if her fingers hurt. Her father, usually so composed, kept looking at the tape measure and then at Madame Malkin's hands, as if trying to work out which part of the process contained the trick. A bolt of black fabric floated from a shelf and wrapped itself around Elenina's shoulders. It wasn't frightening. It moved with the steady competence of someone folding laundry in a practiced way. The fabric settled into the shape of a robe, smoothing itself, adjusting the hem, tightening slightly at the cuffs. Elenina watched, fascinated, as pins placed themselves precisely along seams, then lifted and relocated as if correcting their own mistakes. Her mother inhaled sharply. "It's all right," Elena whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to her mother or to herself. Madame Malkin smiled at them, over the top of Elenina's shoulder. "It always looks odd to Muggle parents. You'll get used to it. There. Perfect." She stepped back, eyes narrowing with professional focus. "Growing room," she added, and tapped the hem lightly with her wand. "Everyone grows the first year. It's practically tradition. Hogwarts does something to children. Fresh air, castle drafts, or perhaps they simply grow because they're excited." Helena's father made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "You say that as if it's scientific." Madame Malkin's eyes twinkled. "Magic and science share more than people think, mister." "Ashworth," Robert said quickly. "Robert Ashworth." "Well, Mr. Ashworth," Madame Malkin replied, "whether it's scientific or not, it's true. Now, 3 sets of plain work robes, 1 pointed hat, and, given the weather, let's talk about winter." "Winter?" Margaret repeated, startled. "But school starts in September." "Yes, and September becomes October, and October becomes you wondering why your child didn't bring enough layers," Madame Malkin said lightly. "Scottish Highlands are no joke, even when the castle is warm. And the grounds, children insist on going outside, even when it's raining sideways." Elenina pictured this. A castle in the Highlands. Rain going sideways. It sounded like a place that didn't apologize for being itself. Madame Malkin selected a cloak from a rack that looked too heavy to hang properly, yet hung as if it were weightless. She draped it over Elena's shoulders, and warmth spread through her immediately, blooming from the inside out, easing into her hands, her feet, her cheeks. Elena blinked in surprise. "It's warm." "Warming charm," Madame Malkin said matter-of-factly. "Balanced, of course. You won't overheat indoors, but you won't freeze outside. And a scarf? Yes. Gloves, too. There." Her mother watched the process with the expression of someone witnessing rules being rewritten in front of her eyes. "And this is norm?" Margaret asked. "For us," Madame Malkin said gently. Elena looked at her mother, then really looked, and saw something in Margaret's face beyond worry. Pride. A careful tenderness. The kind of love that says, "I don't understand this world, but I will learn it because it belongs to you now." When the robes were folded and stacked, when the cloak was fastened with silver clasps that caught the light, when the pointed hat was adjusted to sit properly, though it still insisted on sliding forward in a way that made Elena feel faintly ridiculous, Madame Malkin wrapped everything in brown paper and tied it neatly with string. Her father paid with the new coins, counting slowly, still half expecting them to dissolve or change shape in his palm. Each coin clinked with a sound that felt strangely satisfying, solid and real. Eleonina held the parcel against her chest as they stepped back outside. The snow had thickened. Street lamps had begun to glow more strongly, though the sky was still pale with afternoon. The light wasn't electric. It was warmer, older, like the glow you got from a lamp left on in a window at home. Eleonina stood for a moment, letting the warmth of the cloak steady her. She felt anchored by the weight of the parcel and the knowledge that inside it were robes that would soon be hers in the same way school uniforms were yours. Not because they were particularly exciting, but because they meant you belonged somewhere. Her father cleared his throat and looked at the list again, as though returning to it would keep him calm. "Next," he said, "cauldron." They walked on. The cauldron shop was exactly what her father had hoped it would be: practical, plain, unapologetically functional. It had a window display of cauldrons arranged like a set of nested bowls, each one polished to a dull gleam. A sign declared, with stern pride, that their wares lasted 7 years and beyond, if treated properly. Inside, the air smelled faintly metallic and clean. Rows upon rows of cauldrons filled the shop, each one labeled with size and material: pewter, brass, copper. Standard and self-stirring, though the self-stirring ones came with warnings about proper maintenance and the importance of not leaving ingredients unattended. A shopkeeper with sleeves rolled up greeted them with a nod that said he had seen countless first-year families and was not particularly moved by their wide-eyed expressions. He asked questions in a calm, business-like way, as if selling a cauldron to an 11-year-old was an everyday transaction, which Elena realized again it was. "Standard size too," the shopkeeper said after glancing at the list and then at Elena. "Pewter, solid. Don't drop it down a staircase and it'll last you through school. Even if you do drop it down a staircase, it might survive. Depends on the staircase." Elena wasn't sure if that was a joke. In this world, staircases might have opinions. Her father seemed relieved. "Good," he said, as if the existence of a standard option comforted him deeply. "Yes." Standard. The shopkeeper wrapped the cauldron in a canvas bag, and it made a soft, steady clink as it settled. He added brass scales with the same brisk practicality, and a small note about how to keep them calibrated. Her father paid, the coins bright against the worn wood of the counter. As they stepped out into the street again, Elenina's stomach reminded her, quietly, politely, that lunch had been earlier than it felt. The day had stretched in her mind, each moment so full it made time behave oddly. Her mother noticed immediately, because her mother always noticed. "We'll eat soon," Margaret promised, consulting a small map they'd been given. "There's a place," Mrs. Seman said. Platon mentioned the leaky cauldron does food. "And there's a sweet shop, too." "A sweet shop?" Elelina repeated. Her mother smiled. "Apparently it's famous." They didn't go straight there, though. Not yet. As they walked, Elenina found her attention tugged in every direction. She saw quills that wrote in midair, practicing loops and flourishes as if bored. She saw a window full of glass jars that held drifting lights like bottled fireflies. She saw a shop selling pets, though pets felt like the wrong word when one of the creatures in the window blinked slowly and looked as though it understood more than any animal should. And through it all, that sense of safety stayed with her. Not the safety of predictability, something else. The safety of being in a place that had rules, even if she didn't know them yet. The people around her weren't chaos. They were simply living. A woman in a deep blue cloak paused beside Elenina and adjusted a scarf around her own neck with a small, elegant movement. "First year?" she asked lightly. Elena nodded, too shy to speak. The woman smiled. "You'll remember today for the rest of your life." Then she walked on, leaving the words behind like something warm. Elenina looked at her parents and saw that they too were changing with each step. Her father still wore the expression of someone trying to understand a complicated puzzle, but his shoulders had dropped slightly, as if he had stopped bracing for the street to vanish. Her mother's grip on her hand loosened just a little, not because she cared less, but because she was beginning to trust that this world wasn't waiting to hurt them. They reached a wider section of street, where the buildings opened up and the snowfall seemed to glow under the lamps. And there, ahead, a tall, narrow shop rose like a tower of green and gold. Flourish and Blotts. Elenina stopped before they even reached the door. The windows were filled with books, so many that it looked impossible the glass could hold all that weight. Some books sat neatly stacked. Others leaned at odd angles as if mid-conversation. A few shifted slightly, adjusting their positions on their own, like people making room on a crowded bench. The sign above the door proclaimed it had been there for centuries, and her father, almost helplessly, did the maths under his breath again. Elenina didn't mind. It was his way of holding on to something. Her mother lifted her chin, read the name, and then looked at Elenina with a steadying smile. "Ready?" she asked. Elenina took a deep breath. She thought about her muggle books at home, the comfort of paper and ink, the quiet certainty of stories that waited patiently to be opened. She thought about the list in her mother's hand, and the school that expected her to read texts written for witches and wizards. She thought about how knowledge could be heavy and wonderful at the same time. She nodded, and together, with the snow falling softly around them, they stepped towards the bookshop door. They stood outside Flourish and Blotts for a moment longer than necessary, as if the shop front was something you approached with the same care you used for a church doorway or a library you'd heard about your entire life but never expected to see. Elenina could feel the warmth of her cloak against her shoulders and the weight of their purchases tugging gently at their arms. The street around them had started to tilt towards afternoon in that slow, quiet way winter days did. No sudden change, just a gradual deepening of color, a softening of light. The street lamps were not fully bright yet, but they seemed ready, as if they were paying attention. Her mother's eyes lingered on the bookshop windows, then drifted to Elena's face, to the way she held herself, alert and bright with everything she was trying to contain. "Before we go in," Margaret said carefully, "I think we should eat." Elena blinked. For a moment she'd forgotten hunger existed, forgotten that her body still had ordinary needs on a day like this. Her stomach reminded her immediately, not rudely, just firmly, as if it had waited patiently for her wonder to calm down before speaking up again. Her father exhaled, as though relieved to be given something straightforward. Yes, Robert agreed. Food. That's sensible. Balenena glanced back at Flourish and Blotts, half afraid it would disappear if she looked away. But it remained, tall and narrow, glowing with lamplight behind the windows, books pressed close together, as if the shop were full of held breath and quiet waiting. "We'll come straight back," her mother promised, reading her expression. So they turned, weaving back through the snow-dusted crowd toward the leaky cauldron. The shift was subtle at first, like stepping from one kind of magic into another. Diagon Alley was bright with movement and color, shops calling for attention, windows full of objects that wanted to be noticed. The leaky cauldron felt different, not less magical, but calmer, in a way Elena hadn't realized she needed, like a hearth in the middle of everything. The courtyard behind it was snow-covered now, the bricks damp and dark. Eleanor paused, watching how the snow there fell more normally, as though even the weather knew this was a place for pauses and warm meals rather than spectacle. Inside, the pub was crowded with people, seeking shelter from the snow and the cold. The air held layers of scent, roast meat, bread, something sweet and spiced that reminded Elenina faintly of Christmas markets, and the comforting smell of old wood warmed by life. Tom the innkeeper, round-faced and friendly, greeted them with a nod and a smile, as if he'd been expecting them. "Back again?" he said, and his tone held no surprise. Of course they were back. People came here to sit down and breathe. Margaret looked a little uncertain, still adjusting to the fact that strangers in this world spoke as if they knew what you needed before you did. But she managed a polite smile. "Yes, please," she said. Do you serve lunch?" Tom's smile widened. "We serve whatever you need. Sit yourselves down. You'll want something warming, with the weather doing what it's doing." He guided them toward a table that had just been cleared near the wall. The bench seat was worn smooth by countless elbows and restless children. A candle burned in a holder that looked ordinary, until Elenina realized it didn't flicker with drafts. Its flame stayed steady, calm, as if it had been taught. Elenina slid in beside her mother and watched the room. Conversations drifted around them, half understandable and half entirely strange. She heard someone mention a regulation change, with the same seriousness her father used when he talked about building codes. She heard someone else discussing something called hexproofing, and a man at a nearby table was complaining that a shipment of potion ingredients had arrived frozen solid because the courier had taken a shortcut through a bad pocket of weather. None of it sounded like a joke. It sounded like life. Ordinary life, in a world where ordinary included things Elenina hadn't even known to imagine. A server came over, a witch with her hair pinned back neatly, carrying a tray that stayed perfectly balanced no matter how she moved. "What will you have?" she asked kindly. Margaret glanced at her husband, then at Elenina, still unsure if there were rules she didn't know. Tom appeared again, as if sensing the hesitation. "Steak and kidney pie's good today," he said. "Mash, gravy. Keeps you steady." "Thank you," Robert said quickly. Yes, that sounds perfect." Elena watched her father as he spoke. He was trying to act normal, trying to be polite in the way he'd been raised to be, but his eyes kept drifting to everything, to a coat rack that held cloaks that shifted slightly as if rearranging themselves for comfort, to a small cat curled by the fire that looked up far too knowingly, to the way someone across the room lifted a cup, and the liquid inside swirled briefly, as if responding to their mood. When the food arrived, it arrived with a sort of quiet ceremony that made it feel like more than a meal. The pie was rich and browned on top, steam rising when Elenina cut into it. The mashed potatoes were creamy and hot, and the gravy tasted like warmth. It wasn't complicated food. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of meal that anchored you, that reminded you your body was still yours, even if your life had just been rearranged. Elenina ate slowly, not because she wasn't hungry, but because she didn't want to rush anything today. She wanted time to keep holding her. Her mother's shoulders eased as she ate. With each bite, Margaret seemed to become more like herself again, the worry loosening, the tightness around her mouth softening. Even her father stopped scanning the room quite so sharply, and for the first time since stepping through the wall, he looked as if he might actually be enjoying himself. "This is good," Margaret said quietly, surprised. Robert nodded, swallowing. "It is. It's normal, in a way." Elenina understood what he meant. It was a magical pub, yes, full of witches and wizards, but it was also a place where people came to eat lunch and talk about their week. That normality made the rest of the day feel less like a dream and more like a new reality. When they finished, Tom appeared again with the ease of someone who lived on the rhythm of the room. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret said, sincere. "Thank you." Tom nodded, pleased, as if he'd done something important. And perhaps he had. Perhaps the ability to make overwhelmed people feel a little steadier was its own sort of magic. They stepped back out into the courtyard, and the snow greeted them again, soft and persistent. The air felt colder now after the warmth inside, but Elelina's cloak kept her comfortable, the charm responding as if it understood the difference between indoors and out. When they returned to Diagon Alley, the street seemed changed by the meal, not because anything was different, but because Elelena was different. The hunger that had been tugging at her was gone. The dizziness of pure wonder had settled into something calmer, more usable. She could look properly now. She could take things in without feeling as though she might float away. They walked back to Flourish and Blotts, their steps leaving no clear prints on the cobblestones, because the walkway still stayed mysteriously clear. Snow gathered in corners, on ledges, on the tops of signs, but the path itself remained open, as if politely maintained by unseen hands. At the bookshop door, her mother paused and squeezed Elenina's hand. "Ready?" Margaret asked again, but this time her voice held less worry and more quiet confidence. Eliana nodded. And then they went in. Flourish and Blotts was not merely a shop. It was a world built out of paper and ink and centuries of curiosity. The inside stretched far deeper than the outside could possibly allow. Aisles ran narrow and tall between shelves that rose into shadow. Books, pressed close together like a crowd, their spines forming a kind of textured tapestry. Colors, titles, symbols that shifted when Elelina looked too quickly. A spiral staircase of dark iron wound upward through the center of the shop, leading to higher floors where more shelves waited. Ladders leaned against walls at odd angles, and some of them moved a little on their own, sliding a few inches as if adjusting to where they were needed. The air smelled exactly how Elelena had always thought a great bookshop should smell. Old paper, binding glue, dust, leather, but layered with something else, something faintly herbal and sharp, like the idea of knowledge made into a scent. And the books were not quiet, not loud, not disruptive, but alive in small ways. Some rustled their pages like a bird settling its wings. Some hummed softly as if content. A few emitted faint puffs of colored smoke at irregular intervals, and one shelf, higher up, held a row of books that shivered occasionally, as if impatient. Elenina stood still for a moment, overwhelmed in a new way. Her mother's fingers tightened again, but not as hard as before. It was the reflex of care, not panic. Her father's eyes went straight to the highest shelves, as if the architecture offended him personally. "It's bigger inside," he murmured, with the stunned tone of someone stating a fact he knows cannot be fact. A young man appeared beside them with the smooth, practiced ease of someone used to guiding first-timers. He wore deep blue robes with gold trim and carried a clipboard that seemed to be updating itself with glowing ink. His hair was neat, his expression calm. His name badge read Marcus. "First year list?" Marcus asked, friendly but efficient. Margaret produced the parchment, like someone presenting paperwork at a new school. "Yes," she said, and then, as if apologizing, added, We're new to all this." Marcus smiled, not unkindly. "We can tell. Don't worry. That's what we're here for." Elena felt an unexpected rush of gratitude, not because he was doing something extraordinary, but because he was treating them like they belonged here, even if they didn't yet know how. He glanced at the list, nodding as he read. Right. Standard first-year set. I'll pull your required books. While I do, you can browse here. He gestured toward a section clearly marked for first years. The shelves there were lower, the labels clearer, the books arranged in a way that felt slightly more approachable. It was as though the shop itself understood that new students needed a gentler beginning. Marcus moved with quick precision, selecting books from the shelves and stacking them on the counter nearby. Elena watched as the pile grew. The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1. A slim purple book with silver lettering, a history of magic, thick and dusty, with a cover that looked tired. Magical Theory, heavier than the title suggested. A beginner's guide to transfiguration. A volume on herbs and fungi. A potions text beasts and where to find them. And a book on the dark forces that made Elena swallow hard, even before she'd touched it. Her mother stared at the stack, eyebrows lifting. "That's quite a lot." It's a lot of learning," Elena said quietly, and surprised herself by how steady she sounded. Her father looked down at her, something like pride flickering in his eyes. "Yes," he said, as if he'd always known she would meet this with seriousness rather than fear. Elianina stepped closer to the shelves and let her fingers hover near the spines. Not touching at first, just reading titles. Some of them were straightforward. Some of them sounded like riddles. There were books about charms and basic spells, about magical etiquette, about castle history. A thin book near the end of the shelf was titled A Beginner's Guide to Magical Mistakes and How to Fix Them. And Elena thought, with relief, that at least someone had anticipated that beginners would make mistakes. "Elena Ashworth?" She turned. A girl stood a few feet away, older than Elena by several years, wearing school robes trimmed in bronze and blue. Ravenclaw colors, Elena remembered from earlier overheard conversations. The girl held several books in her arms and balanced them with practiced ease. Her expression was open, curious, and kind in the way older students sometimes were when they remembered what it felt like to be new. "Yes," Elena said cautiously. The girl's face brightened. "I thought so. I heard Marcus say your name. I'm Padma Patil, 6th year, prefect." She shifted her books and offered her hand. Elenina shook it, feeling suddenly shy. "Hello." Padma smiled. "First time in Diagon Alley?" "First time anywhere," Elena admitted. "I didn't know about magic until the letter." Padma's expression softened with understanding. "Muggle-born, then?" "Yes." "Right," Padma said, as if that explained a great deal. "Listen, I know you're probably trying to take in everything at once, and it's too much. And you'll go home tonight and feel like your head is full of fog. But I wanted to give you a bit of advice. The kind I wish someone had given me before first year. Eliana felt relief wash through her. Real relief. Someone older. Someone who knew. Someone offering help without asking for anything. Please, Elelenina said. Padma nodded and tilted her head towards the stack Marcus had gathered. Okay. First book, A History of Magic. Alalena glanced at the dusty volume. Padma's mouth twitched. It's dull. I'm not going to lie. Professor Binns is a ghost, and he can make even the most interesting event sound like a shopping receipt. But the history matters. The magical world has scars and stories you won't understand without context. Read the chapters. Take notes. Don't expect it to be thrilling. Her mother looked faintly alarmed at the mention of ghosts. Padma continued, unfazed. Magical theory is actually fascinating, if you like understanding why magic works the way it does. Most people ignore it until they're struggling, and then suddenly they care. If you read it early, you'll be ahead. Elalena's father's eyes sharpened with interest. Theory, he repeated, like a man hearing a lifeline. There's a why? Padma smiled. There are a lot of whys. Not all of them have neat answers. But yes, there's a structure. Her father looked almost grateful, as if the existence of structure made the entire magical world less frightening. Padma pointed at the purple book, the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1. This is your best friend. Clear instructions, diagrams. It even corrects your pronunciation sometimes. That's helpful, not rude. Think of it as a teacher who lives in the book, a book that corrects you, Margaret murmured, still astonished. You'll get used to it, Padma said gently. Shh. Transfiguration. Your book will look intimidating, but Professor McGonagall is strict and brilliant. She expects you to work hard, but she teaches properly. You'll learn more from her than you realize at the time. At the time. Elenina's mind flicked to her chocolate frog card earlier in the day, Professor McGonagall's stern face with kindness beneath it. She's headmistress now, isn't she? Elenina asked. She is, Padma said, and there was clear respect in her voice. But she still teaches first years. Says she won't give up teaching entirely. Hogwarts is her home, and she takes that seriously. There was something in Padma's tone that hinted at more than school pride, something deeper. Elenina hesitated, then asked quietly, People keep mentioning the war. Padma's expression went still, but not cold. Just careful. Yes, she said softly. They will. Because it wasn't that long ago. Elelena swallowed. She had heard fragments all day, spoken gently, spoken in passing, but present like a shadow at the edge of bright shop windows. Padma adjusted the books in her arms. You don't need to carry all of that today, she said, voice calm. But you do need to know that the magical world isn't only whimsy and wonder. It's beautiful, but it can be dangerous. That's why Hogwarts teaches defense. That's why rules exist. And that's why the adults can look protective. Oh. Her mother's hand tightened on Elena's shoulder, protective in the most literal sense. But, Padma added, meeting Elena's eyes steadily, Hogwarts is safer now than it has ever been. The castle was rebuilt stronger. The people there, professors, staff, they understand what it means to keep children safe. They won't let you face darkness alone. Not ever. The way she said it made Elena believe her. Her father cleared his throat. Were you at Hogwarts when it happened? Padma hesitated, then shook her head. I was meant to be, she said quietly. I was old enough. My sister and I, we were supposed to fight. But our parents sent us away, kept us safe. I'm grateful, and I'm also complicated about it. Elena didn't fully understand, but she understood enough. Safety and guilt, relief and regret. The strange weight of being protected when others weren't. Padma blinked once, steadying herself, then smiled, as if deciding she wouldn't let the heaviness stay too long. Anyway, she said briskly, brightening the moment deliberately, optional reading. Elena's father leaned in again, grateful for the practical shift. Optional? Padma nodded. You don't need these, but they help. The Tales of Beedle the Bard. Get it? It's wizarding culture. Fairy tales every magical child grows up with. You'll hear references constantly. And it's actually lovely. Her mother looked relieved by the idea of fairy tales, something familiar. And if you want something genuinely useful, Padma continued, a beginner's guide to household charms. Not glamorous, but it's the sort of book that saves you time and trouble. It teaches you spells you'll end up using constantly. Little things that make your life easier. Marcus returned then, the stack complete and neatly arranged, as if he'd built it with pride. All set, he said. Required books. And I've pulled The Tales of Beedle the Bard as well, since it's recommended for first years. Padma gave him a pointed look. Good. Marcus smiled, unbothered. I try to look after my customers. Elena watched as Marcus placed the final book on the pile. The cover showed an illustration that looked like a fountain, drawn in a style that felt old and gentle. Her father eyed the stack, and then, as if bracing himself, asked, How much? Marcus named the price. Robert Ashworth did not flinch, but Elena saw the slight tightening at the corner of his mouth. Not anger, just the sober awareness that the world her daughter was entering had its own costs, and those costs were real. He paid anyway, without hesitation. Because this mattered. Because she mattered. Marcus charmed the bag so it would be lighter, explaining it with the same tone a shop assistant might use to describe a sturdy handle. It won't feel weightless, he said, but you won't be carrying the full burden. Elena took the bag and felt immediate surprise. It should have been heavy. It wasn't. It had weight, yes, but manageable, like carrying a few books rather than a small library. Padma watched her reaction and smiled. You'll be grateful for that charm after your first week, she said. Trust me. Eleonina looked down at the bag, then up at the shelves that stretched into shadow above them. The bookshop felt endless, full of things she wanted to know. She felt the shape of her future tightening and becoming clearer, not as a single image, but as a path. Padma shifted her books again, preparing to leave. One more piece of advice, she said. Yes, Elena asked quickly. Padma's eyes softened. Use the library, she said simply. Don't only read what you're assigned. Wander. Ask questions. Some of the most important things you learn at Hogwarts are the things you find because you're curious. Eleanina nodded, feeling the words settle in her chest like something she would keep. And, Padma added with a small grin, if you end up in Ravenclaw, you'll find we take reading very seriously. Common room in a tower, bronze knocker, riddles, best view in the castle. And we keep the fire going all night for anyone who wants to study. Ellena's mind pictured it immediately. A tower room, warm light, books open late into the night, the quiet comfort of people reading together. I don't know where I'll end up, Elena admitted. Padma's grin turned gentle. None of us truly knows before the hat. she said. "But wherever you land, you'll find your people. Hogwarts has a way of doing that." She waved and disappeared into the aisles, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged completely to this world. Elenina stood for a moment, holding the bag of books, feeling the gentle tug of its weight. Knowledge gathered up and made portable. A whole first year's worth of learning, waiting for her. Her father rested a hand on her shoulder again, warm and steady. "You all right?" he asked softly. Elena nodded. "Yes," she said, and meant it. I didn't realize it would feel so real." Her mother reached for her hand. "It's real," Margaret agreed quietly. "And you're going to be all right." They stepped back out of Flourish and Blotts into the snow-lit street. The afternoon had deepened toward evening now. The street lamps glowed brighter, painting the falling snow in warm gold. Shops were beginning to close, shutters lowering, lights dimming behind windows. Diagon Alley was still alive, but it was settling, easing into night. Elianina clutched her bag of books and felt, in a calm, certain way, that she had crossed another threshold, not only into the magical world, but into the part of it that would shape her, the learning, the history, the knowledge that came with responsibility. Her mother glanced at the parchment list again, now creased and softened from being handled all day. "One shop left," she said, voice careful. Elenina felt her breath catch. She knew which shop. She had been carrying it in her mind like a quiet star. Her father squared his shoulders, the way he did before difficult meetings. "Ollivanders," he said. Elenina looked down the street, and though the snow and the lamplight softened everything, she could see it in her imagination already. The narrow shop, the faded sign, the doorway that led into shadows older than anyone she knew. Somewhere inside it, a wand waited. The walk to Ollivanders felt different from every other stretch of Diagon Alley. It wasn't that the street had changed. The snow still drifted down in soft, purposeful spirals, catching the lamplight like scattered sugar. The windows still glowed with warmth, and the last few shoppers still moved from doorway to doorway with parcels tucked under their arms. But for Elena, the air seemed to tighten around one idea, one destination, as if the whole day had been quietly leading her here. Her bag of books rested against her hip, lightened by charm but still solid enough to remind her that this was real. The canvas bag holding her cauldron clinked faintly as her father carried it, a steady little sound that made the situation feel strangely practical. Robes, books, a cauldron, all pieces of a life that hadn't existed yesterday. And now, the wand. Elenina kept her hands inside the pockets of her warmed cloak, not because she was cold, but because she needed somewhere to put her nerves. Every few steps, she found herself looking at her parents to see how they were doing, as if their faces might tell her whether she should be brave or cautious. Margaret Ashworth was still smiling, but there was a tightness at the corners of her mouth that hadn't been there during lunch. She had read the list so many times it had become a kind of ritual, and now that they were on the final item, she seemed to be holding herself steady by remembering every instruction she'd been given. Robert Ashworth looked thoughtful. He had been quiet since Flourish and Blotts, and Elelina could tell his mind was working in the way it always did when he tried to solve something, turning it over, searching for a pattern. But some things didn't become comfortable simply because you found the pattern. Some things stayed strange until you lived with them long enough for your body to stop bracing. They passed Madame Malkin's again, now with its lights dimmed as the day edged into evening. The window mannequins stood patiently, draped in robes that looked almost like shadows given shape. They passed the cauldron shop, shutters half lowered. They passed Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, still blazing with warm color, as if the shop refused to allow darkness any authority. Ileana glanced at the window as they walked by, and for a moment she saw Verity again inside, leaning over a counter, wrapping something in brown paper for a customer. The glow of the shop made the snow beyond it look softer, gentler. Elena thought of the memorial photograph her father had noticed earlier, the careful flowers, the name on the plaque, and felt something settle in her chest. A quiet understanding that joy here wasn't accidental. It was chosen, built, protected. They moved on. Ollivanders appeared ahead, like a pause in the street. The shop front was narrow, almost squeezed between its neighbors, and painted black in a way that had faded with time rather than been refreshed. The gold lettering above the door, Ollivanders, makers of fine wands since 382 BC, was worn, some of the letters softened at the edges as if the sign had been breathed on by centuries. The window display was simple. Only one wand rested on a faded purple cushion, as if the shop didn't need to advertise, as if it could afford to be quiet, because everyone came anyway. Snowflakes drifted past the glass and seemed, strangely, to change their minds. A few veered away at the last second, spiraling aside rather than settling on the window ledge. Elena watched that small detail and felt a shiver move down her spine that had nothing to do with cold. Elena, her mother said softly, noticing she had stopped. Are you all right? Elena swallowed. What if? What if there isn't one for me? Her mother's brow creased. A wand? Elena nodded quickly, the fear that had been hovering at the edge of her day, finally stepping fully into the light. What if he tries and nothing works? What if I'm wrong for this? Robert's hand tightened gently on the cauldron bag. He shifted closer. Then we'll sort it out, he said with calm certainty. Whatever happens, we'll sort it out together. But Elena wasn't really hearing him. She was staring at the doorway, at the narrow slice of darkness beyond the glass, at the idea of thousands of wands waiting in boxes stacked to a ceiling she couldn't see. Somewhere in there, she was supposed to find something that belonged to her, something that would recognize her. It felt like asking a stranger to confirm that you were real. A voice spoke beside her, and Elena startled so sharply she nearly stepped back into her mother. First wand? Elena turned. A girl stood there, perhaps 13, with honey blonde hair braided neatly down her back and eyes the color of storm clouds. She wore Hogwarts robes trimmed in yellow and black. Hufflepuff. Her expression was kind in a way that didn't feel performative. It felt like she truly meant it. Elena blinked. Yes, she managed. The girl's smile softened, as if she had expected exactly that answer. You have the look, she said. Everyone does. Like you're standing on the edge of a cliff, and someone is telling you to step forward. Elena couldn't help it. She let out a small, breathy laugh. It was too accurate. I'm Luna, the girl said. Luna Lovegood. Elena's mind stumbled over the name. It sounded like a storybook name, like something you'd read and think, no one is actually called that, and yet here she was, real as snow and lamplight. Elena said automatically. Elena Ashworth. Luna tilted her head, studying her with the intensity of someone looking at the world in a way Elena hadn't learned yet. It wasn't rude. It was simply direct, like she wasn't pretending not to notice things. You're worried, Luna said gently, as if naming it made it smaller. Elena nodded, unable to deny it. It will choose you, Luna said, with a certainty so calm it felt like being handed a blanket. It's already waiting. Elena's throat tightened. How do you know? Because that's how wand magic works, Luna replied, as though the answer was simple. It isn't like buying a winter coat. You don't choose it the way you choose things in shops. You and the wand are meant to meet. Elelena frowned slightly. But what if... Luna lifted a hand, not cutting her off sharply, just gently interrupting the spiral. Mr. Ollivander told me the same thing when I was afraid right here. He said the wand had been growing in a tree long before I ever knew I existed. Then it was made and put in a box and waited. All that time, leading to one moment when I walked through that door. It wasn't an accident. It was a meeting. Elelena stared at her. That sounds... Do not forget my teaching. Luna's smile turned a little brighter. Most important things are. Elelena didn't know what to do with that, but the softness in Luna's voice made it easier to breathe. You should go in now, Luna said, glancing at the dim shop front. Mr. Ollivander doesn't like being kept waiting. He is patient, but he also likes things to happen when they're meant to happen. Elelena glanced toward the window again. The single wand on the cushion looked inert, but something in her body insisted the shop was listening. Luna shifted the small parcel in her arms. And Elelena? Yes? When you find the right wand, Luna said, voice lower, gentler, you'll know. It feels like coming home. Elelena held on to that sentence, the way you held onto a handrail when you weren't sure of your footing. Thank you, she whispered. Luna smiled as if the thanks were unnecessary. Then she drifted away into the snow-softened street, her braids swinging lightly behind her, disappearing into the last of the shoppers as if she'd never been there at all. Elenina turned back to her parents. Her father's eyebrows were raised. Peculiar girl, he murmured. Her mother watched Luna's retreating figure with a softer expression. Kind, Margaret said. And she's right. We can't stand out here forever. Elelena nodded, though her feet still felt rooted. As if to prove that the street had its own way of shepherding people through their nerves, another witch emerged from Ollivanders a moment later. She was middle-aged, wrapped in a burgundy travel cloak, and her face held the bright, satisfied look of someone who had just completed something important.
She held a wand carefully, like something living. As she passed Elena, she paused.
First wand, the witch asked, echoing Luna. Elenina nodded again, feeling faintly ridiculous. Was it written on her forehead? The witch's expression softened. Don't be frightened, she said. He's odd, Mr. Ollivander. But he knows his craft better than anyone. I've had mine for 30 years. Blackthorn and dragon heartstring. Never failed me. Elena's mother looked as though she wanted to ask 100 questions, but didn't know which were allowed. The witch patted Elena's shoulder once, firm and reassuring. Trust the process, she said simply. Trust the magic. Then she moved on, and the words lingered behind her like something warm. Elelena was drawing breath to step forward when a young man approached from the other direction. He looked around 17 or 18, with warm brown eyes and a familiar, easy posture that made him seem like someone who had been a teenager in this street not long ago. He wore casual robes and a scarf wrapped around his neck. And when he saw Elelena standing frozen in front of Ollivanders, something sympathetic crossed his face. First wand? He asked. Elelena's mouth twitched. Is it that obvious? He smiled. It always is, because everyone remembers standing exactly where you are. He shifted his parcels in his arms and offered his free hand. Dean, he said. Dean Thomas. I graduated a couple of years ago, but I come back sometimes for supplies. Seeing first years doing the big day is, well, it reminds you. Elena shook his hand. Elena. Nice to meet you, Dean said, then glanced at her parents and nodded politely. You look like you're about to walk into a storm. Elena's father gave a strained little laugh. That's one way to describe it. Dean turned back to Elena. Were you scared? He asked, voice gentle. When you got your letter? Elena nodded, relieved to be understood. I keep thinking, what if it was a mistake? Dean's smile softened. I thought the same, he admitted. I'm Muggle-born too. I kept expecting someone to tell me there'd been an error, that I'd been sent the wrong letter. But it doesn't work like that. He angled his chin toward the shop. Ollivander measured me, tried wands, and when the right one landed in my hand, it was like someone had handed me the missing piece of myself. Like I'd been holding my breath without realizing it, and suddenly I could breathe properly. Boo! Elena's chest ached with longing for that feeling. Luna said it feels like coming home, Elena murmured. Dean's eyebrows lifted. Luna Lovegood? Elena nodded. Dean smiled in recognition. Yeah, that sounds like Luna. She's odd, but she's usually right about the important things. He glanced at the sky, which had deepened toward early twilight. You should go in, he said. It's getting late. Ollivander closes when he feels like it, honestly. He keeps wand maker hours, which are different from normal people hours. Elena felt herself hesitate again, and Dean's voice gentled further. Whatever you're worried about, he said, it won't happen the way you think. The wand that's meant for you is in there. It's been in there longer than you've been alive. All you have to do is take the step. Elena swallowed hard. Dean shifted his parcels again and offered her a final encouraging smile. You'll do brilliantly, he said, like Verity and Padma and everyone else who seemed to hand out that sentence like a blessing. You're already doing it. You're here. Then he nodded to her parents again and walked away down the street, disappearing into a shop that smelled faintly of owl treats and winter herbs. Elena was alone again, except she wasn't really alone. Her parents stood beside her, close enough that she could feel their warmth. Margaret took her hand, gentler now than she had been earlier. We're right here, she said quietly. Whatever happens. Elena stared at the shop front again. The black paint, the faded gold letters, the single wand in the window like a promise. Her fear shifted into something else, still present, but mixed now with determination. Her father crouched in the snow without hesitation, heedless of his trousers, and looked her directly in the eyes the way he did when he needed her to believe him. Elena Rose Ashworth, he said firmly, using her middle name the way he did when he was serious. You received a letter delivered by an owl. We walked through a wall into a street that shouldn't exist. You bought school robes made by a tape measure that measured you by itself. If magic didn't think you belonged, we wouldn't have made it past the first step. Elena's throat tightened. But what if... No, he said. Not harshly, just decisively. No more what if. You belong. Now we're going to go in there, and we're going to find the wand that's waiting for you. He stood again, brushing snow from his knees. Eliana drew a slow breath. Cold air. Cinnamon from somewhere. The faint sharpness of magic that she was beginning to recognize. Okay, she whispered. Her mother's smile trembled, but it was real. Okay, Margaret echoed. Elena stepped forward. The brass handle was cold through her glove, and for a moment she paused on the threshold, balanced between two lives. She could feel the street behind her, Lamplight, snow, the gentle bustle of people finishing their errands. She could feel the shop ahead of her, quiet and dark and waiting. Then the door opened without a sound, and Elenina Ashworth walked into Ollivanders. The shop swallowed them whole. That was the first thought that came, immediate and clear, not frightening, but absolute, as if the doorway had not led into a small shop, but into a pocket of space that belonged to itself. The air inside held the scent of wood in 100 varieties, cedar and oak and elder, pine and cherry, holly and willow, layered with dust and thyme. It smelled like trees and old paper and quiet. The shop was narrow and deep. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, packed with long, thin boxes stacked so high they disappeared into shadow. The light was dim, but not unpleasant. Soft, as though it had learned to be gentle out of respect for what lived here. Elenia could hear almost nothing. No street noise. No voices from outside. Only the quiet settling of old wood and the faintest suggestion of something else. A low vibration, not quite sound, but presence. Thousands of wands, waiting. Her parents stood close behind her. She could feel her mother's hand on her shoulder, protective, her father's breath steadying. A small bell had chimed when they entered, but no one appeared. They waited. Elenina became aware of how still the shop was, as though the shelves were listening, as though the boxes were listening, as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment. Then, from the shadows at the back, a voice spoke, soft, thin, as if it wasn't used often. Good evening. Elenina jumped despite herself. A man emerged from the darkness, and he looked as if he belonged to the shop in the way a portrait belonged to its frame. Mr. Ollivander was very old. His hair stood in white tufts around a face lined with years, but his eyes, pale, almost colorless, like winter mist, were sharp and strangely young. They fixed on Elenina with an intensity that made her feel as if she had been seen completely in a single glance. Elenina Ashworth, he said, and the fact that he knew her name made her stomach flutter. Age, 11. Right-handed. Her mother made a small sound of surprise. How did you— The wands, Ollivander said, as though that explained everything. They talk in their way. Elena's mouth went dry. She had believed, intellectually, that this would happen, that the wand would choose her. But standing in the shop, hearing the wand maker speak as if the objects around them had voices, made the whole thing feel heavier, more real, more serious. Ollivander glided closer, and Elena had the odd impression that he moved like a man who spent so much time among waiting things that he had learned to move quietly out of respect. "Which is your wand arm?" he asked. "Wand arm?" Elenina repeated. "The hand you write with, child," Ollivander said. And there was no impatience in his voice, only the faintest suggestion that this was a question he had asked many times. Elenina held out her right arm. A silver measuring tape leapt into Ollivander's hand and began to move by itself, measuring her with brisk precision, shoulder to fingertip, wrist to elbow, the width of her palm, the length of her fingers. It wrapped around her head, measured between her eyes, then from her nose to her chin, as if taking her entire existence as data. Elenina held herself still, cheeks warm, aware of her parents watching. "All right, Ollivander," murmured when the tape finally fell slack. "Yes, I see." He moved to the shelves, pale eyes scanning boxes as if he could read their contents through wood and dust. "Every wand," he said more to himself than to them, "has a core of powerful magical substance. Phoenix feather, dragon heartstring, unicorn hair. dragon heartstring, and the wood. Wood matters. The wood remembers. The wood chooses. Elena's heart beat hard against her ribs. Ollivander pulled down a box and opened it with a careful motion, as if each wand deserved respect simply for existing. Maple, he said, holding the wand out. Dragon heartstring, 9 inches. Elena took it. It was smooth and cool, and for a moment she felt hopeful. Wave, Ollivander said. Eleanor lifted the wand and made a small, uncertain motion. Nothing dramatic happened. No burst, no chaos. Only a small tremor in the air, like a sigh that wasn't hers, and the candle flame nearest them leaned away, bending as if in mild disapproval. Ollivander's head tilted. No, he murmured, and he took it back gently. Not you. He tried another. Peach, he said. Unicorn hair. 8.5. This one felt oddly heavy in Elena's hand, as if it didn't like being held. When she waved it, the stack of empty boxes on the counter shifted, sliding a few inches as if trying to get away. Ollivander's lips pressed together. No. Another wand. Rowan. Phoenix feather. Too warm, too eager. Another. Ash. Too rigid. Another. Willow. He paused mid-motion, eyes narrowing, and removed it from her hand almost immediately, as if he had realized something he didn't want to test. Her parents watched silently now, their earlier curiosity replaced by a careful tension. Margaret's hand stayed firm on Elena's shoulder. Robert stood close, as if he could shield his daughter from disappointment by sheer proximity. Elena's own anxiety rose with each rejection, not because anything terrible was happening, but because each failed attempt made the fear she'd spoken aloud outside feel closer to truth. What if none of them fit? Ollivander moved faster, pulling boxes from higher shelves with ease that didn't match his age. He muttered under his breath as he worked. Names of woods, lengths, cores, flexibility, like someone narrowing down an answer by instinct as much as logic. Eliana kept taking wands and handing them back, her palm beginning to feel tired, her fingers tingling faintly as if they were being tested by invisible threads. And then, just when her hope began to wobble, Ollivander stopped. He went very still, head slightly tilted, as if listening to something Elena couldn't hear. His pale eyes shifted toward the deepest shadows at the back of the shop. Curious, he whispered. He moved away from them, deeper into the narrow corridor of shelves where the light was dimmest. For a moment, Elena could barely see him, only the pale shape of his hair, the faint glimmer of his eyes. Then he reached upward, higher than seemed possible without a ladder, and drew down a box, so dust-covered it looked as if it had not been touched in years. He carried it forward with an unusual care, as though the box held something delicate and important. He set it on the counter. The label was faded. The corners were worn. The dust across the top made it look like it had been waiting patiently for a very long time. Ollivander opened it slowly. Inside lay a wand that seemed, even in the dim light, to hold its own soft glow. The wood was pale, almost white, with a subtle grain that caught the light like flowing water. The handle was carved with spirals, intricate, deliberate, as if the wand carried a language in its shape. Hawthorn, Ollivander breathed. Phoenix feather. 9.5 inches. Elena's breath caught. Ollivander looked up at her, and for the first time his expression showed something like recognition. Not surprise exactly. More like a person finding a piece that had been missing from a puzzle. This wand, he said quietly, has waited. Elelena reached out. The moment her fingers closed around the hawthorn, warmth surged up her arm. Not heat, not burning, but a steady warmth of belonging, like stepping into a room you didn't realize you'd been homesick for. Her chest loosened. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing became easy. It was as if her body understood before her mind did. The soft golden light gathered at the tip. Not harsh, not blinding, just gentle radiance, like lamplight becoming more itself. Tiny sparks drifted from it in slow, lazy spirals, falling through the air like delicate snow that didn't melt so much as dissolve into warmth. Elena stood very still, watching the light with wide, quiet wonder. She didn't feel frightened. She didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt answered. The glow faded gradually, settling back into the wand, as if it had simply said, "Hello," and then grown calm again. The shop's silence returned, but it had changed. It no longer felt tense or waiting. It felt satisfied, like a held breath released. Ollivander's voice was almost reverent. "Yes," he whispered, "of course." Elena looked at him, still holding the wand as if she might drop it if she moved too quickly. Her mother stepped closer, eyes bright. Is that it?" Ollivander nodded slowly, pale eyes fixed on Elena. "The wand chooses the witch," he said. "And this one has chosen." Elena swallowed. "It feels like—" She struggled for words. "Home," her father supplied softly, as if he knew. Elena nodded, tears prickling unexpectedly. "Yes," she whispered. "Home." Ollivander's fingers hovered near the wand, not touching it, as though he respected the connection now established. "Hawthorne," he murmured again, and there was something thoughtful in his tone. A wood of contradictions, excellent for healing, equally capable in harsher magic. It requires a witch with depth, with complexity, with choices. Elena's mother stiffened slightly at the word choices, but Elena was too full of warmth to feel afraid. She only knew that the wand in her hand felt like it had always belonged there. Ollivander named a price, and her father paid without hesitation. When the coins clinked into Ollivander's palm, the wand maker wrapped the box in brown paper with careful, almost ceremonial movements, and then placed it in Elena's hands as if returning something that was rightfully hers. As Elena turned to leave, Ollivander's hand caught her wrist, surprisingly strong, cold fingers against her warmed glove. His pale eyes bored into hers. "Trust it," he said softly, "when the moment comes." Elena didn't know what moment he meant. She didn't ask. Something about his voice suggested the answer would not be comforting tonight. He released her as abruptly as he'd caught her. Elena stepped back, heart thudding. Her mother immediately moved in front of her, slightly protective, and guided her toward the door. Outside, Diagon Alley looked softer than ever in the twilight. The lamps glowed golden. The snow made everything gentle at the edges. People moved quietly now, heading home, closing shops, tucking the day away. Elena stood on the threshold with her wrapped wand in her hands, feeling its warmth through the paper. "I'm all right," she said quickly when her mother's face tightened with worry. It's a lot." Her father pulled her into a careful hug, mindful of the parcel. "You did it," he murmured. "You're all right." Elena nodded against him, and for a moment she let herself simply exist in that warmth. Parents close, wand chosen. The day's final step completed. She opened the paper carefully and lifted the box lid just enough to see the wand resting inside. The pale wood shimmered softly in the lamplight. The carved spirals cast tiny shadows. It looked both ancient and new, as though it carried history and possibility at the same time. Elanina touched it gently with one fingertip. Warmth answered immediately. Not words, not a voice, just a feeling so clear it might as well have been language. I'm here. Elanina closed the box again, held it against her chest, and looked down the street where the snow drifted and the lamps glowed and the last shops still shone with welcoming light. She felt tired now in the way you felt tired, after a day so full it changed you. But underneath the tiredness was a calm certainty. She belonged. They didn't leave Diagon Alley immediately. Elena had thought all day that the wand would be the last piece, the final lock turning, the moment that made everything complete. And in a way, it did. The warmth of the hawthorn wand in its box against her chest felt like a quiet certainty, like a sentence finished properly. But the street outside Ollivanders was still there, glowing softly under the lamps. Snow drifted down in a steady, patient fall, and the air held that peculiar blend of winter and magic, cold that didn't bite, sweetness that didn't come from any single shop, a faint sharpness like the edge of a storm that never fully arrived. The day was not done simply because the list was complete. The day had its own ending, and it didn't want to be rushed. Margaret stood close to Elena, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder as they stepped away from Ollivanders. Her mother's fingers weren't gripping anymore. The tension had eased out of them, as though the sight of Elena holding the wand box had unclenched something deep and instinctive. Still, Margaret kept her touch there, as if she needed to feel her daughter's presence under her palm to remind herself this was real. Robert walked on Elenina's other side, the cauldron bag in one hand, his other hand tucked into the pocket of his coat. His face was thoughtful, his eyes scanning the street with less alarm now and more quiet attention, as if he'd decided that since he could not understand this world by force of logic, he would at least observe it properly and respect it. Elenina held the wand box inside her bag now, wrapped and tucked among her books where it was safe. But she could still feel it. Not physically, not as a weight, but as a presence. Like a new organ she hadn't known she had, until it started beating in time with her heart. They walked slowly up the street, passing shuttered windows and shops that were preparing to close. As they moved, Elena became aware of how different the alley sounded at this hour. Not quieter exactly, but softer at the edges. Fewer voices layered over one another. More space between footsteps. The occasional murmur of someone saying goodnight to a shopkeeper. The faint creak of a sign turning slightly as if settling. Snow gathered more thickly now in the corners, on ledges, on the tops of doorway arches. A few shopkeepers were sweeping their thresholds with enchanted brooms that moved in neat, tidy patterns, pushing the snow away in spirals that looked almost decorative. And yet the cobblestones underfoot stayed mostly clear, as if the alley itself wanted people to walk safely, even in weather that should have made the ground treacherous. Elena found herself noticing details she had missed earlier. Small plaques beside certain shop doors that marked history, a little brass sign that read, "Established 1743, a painted portrait in a window that appeared to be napping in its frame, hat tipped over its eyes." She wondered if this was what it would be like at Hogwarts, too. The first time you saw it, you'd be overwhelmed by the obvious wonders. And then later, once you'd steadied, you'd start noticing the quieter magic, the things that existed not to impress, but simply because the world here functioned that way. Her mother checked the time on her wristwatch, and her face shifted, a small return of practical concern. "It's getting late," Margaret said softly. "We have a long drive home." Robert nodded. "We should head back." Elena knew they were right, but something in her resisted. not stubbornly, not in the way of a child who didn't want to leave a sweet shop. It was more like the feeling of standing at the end of a holiday day, the kind where you know you have to return to normal life, but you want one more minute of the place that made you feel different. She looked down the street, toward the place where the leaky cauldron courtyard waited, where the brick wall would open to ordinary London. She imagined stepping through and watching the lamplight become electric light, the snow become ordinary snow, the air lose its cinnamon and old parchment scent, and become the familiar smell of damp city winter. She had thought earlier that she would feel relief to return to something she understood, but now she wasn't sure. "Can we just walk a bit more?" Elelina asked quietly. "Just to look." Her mother's mouth softened. She glanced at Robert, and he gave a small, resigned smile that said he understood the request more than he wanted to admit. "All right," Margaret agreed. "Just a little." They walked again, and then Elelena stopped. Ahead, beneath a street lamp that cast the falling snow into warm gold, she saw a familiar figure, dark curly hair pinned back with broomstick clips, a thick jumper under a winter coat, hands full of bags that bumped against her legs. Priya. Elenina's heart jumped in a sudden bright rush. "Pri!" she called, and her voice carried clearly in the softened street. Priya turned, and her face lit up with recognition as if the day had been waiting for this moment too. "Elenina!" Priya hurried toward her, careful not to slip despite the snow. Her mother followed at a slower pace, smiling in a tired, fond way that suggested she was glad her daughter had found someone. Eleana and Priya stood facing each other under the lamplight, and for a moment they were simply two girls with winter coats and shopping bags, grinning as if they'd been friends for years rather than hours. "You're still here," Priya said, amazement in her voice. "We were just about to leave." "So were we," Elenina admitted. We just got done." Priya's eyes widened. "Ollivanders?" Elelena nodded, feeling shy suddenly, as if the wand were a secret even though it was the whole point of the day. "Show me," Priya urged, and her excitement was so open and honest it made Elelena's own nerves soften. Elelena glanced at her parents, silently asking permission. Margaret nodded, and Robert's expression was gentle, as if he understood that this was important. Not just the wand, but the sharing of it. Alona carefully opened her bag and lifted the wrapped wand box out, cradling it, as if it contained something fragile. She unwrapped the brown paper slowly, revealing the worn box. Priya leaned in, eyes bright. Elenina opened it. The hawthorn wand rested on faded velvet, pale wood catching the lamplight in soft ripples. The carved spirals on the handle looked almost alive in the golden glow, shadows curling around them like delicate ink. Priya made a small sound that was half awe, half delight. "It's beautiful." Goal. Elenina felt warmth spread through her chest at the word beautiful, as if the wand itself approved. "What wood?" Priya asked. "Hawthorn," Elenina said, and the word felt like something she'd always known. "Phoenix feather core, 9.5 inches." Priya blinked, absorbing the details like they mattered, and they did. "Phoenix feather," she repeated. That's rare, isn't it?" "I think so," Elelena admitted. "Mr. Ollivander said." She paused, then decided not to share all of it. The words about difficult choices felt too large to hand over casually in the street. Instead, she said, it had been waiting a long time. "How long?" Priya asked, eyes huge. 37 years, Elelena confessed. Priya stared. 37. Elelena nodded. "I know." Priya exhaled, and her breath misted in the lamplight. Mine was made only 5 years ago, she said, almost reverent in her tone. Vinewood. Dragon heartstring, 10 and a quarter. Elenina smiled. Show me. Priya opened her own box with careful hands, lifting her wand out just enough for Elenina to see. It was darker than Elenina's, the wood rich and warm, like polished earth, even without touching it. Elenina could sense that it belonged to Priya, that it matched her in some quiet way. What did it feel like? Elenina asked softly, the question slipping out before she could overthink it. When you found the right one? Priya's face went distant for a moment, as if she were reaching back into the memory. Like someone had been playing music slightly out of tune my whole life, she said slowly. And suddenly, it was perfect. Like everything clicked into place. Elenina nodded, feeling the same truth in her own body. Priya glanced at her. What about you? Elenina thought of the warmth flooding her arm, the golden light blooming softly, the sense of recognition so deep it had felt older than her. Like coming home, she said quietly. Priya's smile softened. Yes, she whispered, as if relieved to hear the same words. Exactly. Their mothers stood nearby, drawn into conversation by the ease of parents who had shared the same strange day. Priya's mother, Anjali, Priya had said earlier, looked tired but calm, her eyes still bright with the afterglow of wonder. Margaret's face held the same mix of exhaustion and tenderness. It's been a day, Priya's mother said, and the understatement made Margaret laugh softly. Yes, Margaret agreed. A day. I don't know how I'll sleep tonight, honestly. Robert stood with them, listening, his expression gentle and slightly dazed. Eliana could tell he was still processing the fact that these women were talking about wand woods and magical schools, as if they were discussing school uniforms and train tickets. He looked like a man whose world had shifted sideways, but who was trying to stand straight inside it. Elena and Priya drifted a little apart from the adults, still under the lamplight, still holding their wand boxes like treasures. Priya's voice lowered. I'm scared, she admitted suddenly. Eleanor's stomach tightened. About Hogwarts? Priya nodded. About everything what? If I'm terrible at magic? What if I can't do the spells? What if everyone else already knows things I don't? Elena felt that fear resonate in her own bones. We're both starting, she said softly. We'll both be confused. Priya gave a small, grateful laugh. Everyone keeps acting like it'll be fine, like Hogwarts is safe. But then they mentioned the war. Alanina swallowed. I know. Priya glanced around, lowering her voice further as if the name itself could startle the snow. Voldemort, she whispered, and the way she said it carried the weight of taboo and history. It's strange, isn't it, knowing something like that happened, that it was real. Elena thought of the photograph at Weasley's, of Padma's quiet voice talking about people who didn't come back, of Ollivander's pale eyes and the way his words had felt like a warning. It's over, Elena said, half statement, half plea. Priya nodded, quickly. It's over, she agreed. Everyone says it's over. That Hogwarts is safer than ever now. That they rebuilt it. That Professor McGonagall is headmistress. And she thawed. Helena felt a strange comfort in that. The idea of a woman who would take a spell to the chest and still return to teach children. The idea of adults who had seen darkness and refused to let it touch the next generation. Priya's eyes flicked toward the adults again, then back to Elena. What if I'm sorted into Slytherin, she said, and her voice held frustration as much as fear. Everyone acts like it's Bad. But that doesn't make sense. A whole house can't be evil for centuries. It's ridiculous. Elalina remembered her own thoughts earlier, the way stereotypes had been spoken casually. Today, passed along like facts rather than assumptions. It doesn't make sense, Elalina agreed. And even if people think things, that doesn't mean they're right. Priya's shoulders loosened slightly, as if she needed permission to believe that. And, Elenena added, trying to sound braver than she felt, even if you're in Slytherin, you'd still be you. Priya smiled, and in that smile was relief. Thank you, she said quietly. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, snow drifting down around them. Then Priya held out her hand, pinky finger extended in a childish gesture that felt strangely serious in the lamplight. Elenina's mouth twitched. Really? Priya's eyes were earnest. Promise. We'll sit together on the train. Elenina hooked her pinky around Priya's. Promise. Priya nodded, as if that sealed something important. Girls? Priya's mother called, and her tone was gentle but firm. We really have to go. Our train leaves soon. Priya's face fell, but she didn't argue. She turned back to Elenina and hugged her, awkward, bags bumping, but fierce in its sincerity. I'm really glad I met you, Priya whispered. Me too, Elenina said, and felt it like truth. Priya pressed a crumpled piece of paper into her hand, her address written in neat letters. Elenina hurriedly gave her own, scribbled earlier. Right, Priya insisted. Even if you don't know how the owl thing works yet. We'll figure it out. Elenina nodded. We will. Priya stepped back and waved one last time before turning to hurry after her mother. Elenina watched her disappear into the snow-softened crowd, and the moment she was gone, Elenina felt a surprising tug of loss. Not heavy, not tragic, just the gentle ache of knowing something good had begun and you didn't want it to pause. Her mother's hand found her shoulder again. That was lovely, Margaret said softly. I'm glad you found someone your age. Elenina nodded, clutching the paper with Priya's address like it was something fragile. Her father's voice was quiet. We should head back, he said. Elenina turned slowly, taking in Diagon Alley one final time. It looked different now than it had in the morning. Not because the shops had changed, but because she had. The street no longer felt like a stranger's dream. It felt like a place she had stepped into and survived, a place that had welcomed her and placed something precious in her hands. Weasley's wizard wheezes still blazed red and gold like a stubborn sun. Honeyduke's glowed warm and sweet, its windows bulging with impossible candy. Flourish and Blotts stood tall and dark now, closed for the evening, but Elalina could almost feel the books inside waiting in their shelves like sleeping minds. Ollivanders remained dimly lit behind them, that single wand still in the window, as if the shop never fully slept. Snow drifted down, soft and steady. Elenina held out her hand and let flakes land on her palm. They sat there, glowing faintly for a heartbeat, before dissolving into tiny sparkles that tingled against her skin. Magical snow. Even now it still astonished her. Ready? Her father asked gently. Elenina nodded, though she didn't want to say goodbye. Yes. They walked back toward the leaky cauldron. The pub was crowded now, filled with people seeking dinner and company. The warmth hit Elenina immediately when they stepped inside. Warmth from bodies and candles and food, and the simple comfort of people gathered together. Tom the innkeeper waved at them from behind the bar and called something friendly that made Margaret smile shyly. They didn't stay. They moved toward the back door, toward the courtyard, toward the brick wall that would return them to the Muggle world. Outside, the courtyard was piled deeper with snow now. The bricks looked darker, damp with cold. Elenina watched her father step forward and tap the bricks in the pattern Mrs. Petton had shown him earlier. 3 up, 2 across. The wall shifted and rearranged itself with soft scraping sounds, opening into an archway. Beyond it, ordinary London waited, cars splashing through slush, people hurrying along pavements with their breath misting in the cold, streetlights glowing with simple electric light. Elenina stood on the threshold again. She didn't want to leave. But she also felt something steadier now. She wasn't leaving empty-handed. She wasn't leaving unsure. She was carrying magic with her. Not only in the bags, not only in the wand box, but in herself. She was a witch. That did not stop being true when she stepped through. Her mother squeezed her hand. "Come on, love," Margaret murmured. Elenina took a deep breath. Snow and cinnamon and possibility still clinging to the air behind her. Then she stepped through. The wall closed with silent finality, and suddenly the world was ordinary again. To anyone passing them on the street, they were just a family carrying shopping bags, looking for their car in the dark. But Elenina could feel the difference like a new layer under her skin. The drive home was quiet. London gave way to motorway, then to familiar darker fields and hedgerows. The landscape of Lancashire unfolded outside the window in winter shadow, snow on roofs, bare trees like ink against the sky, occasional lights of houses tucked into the night. Elenina sat in the back seat with the wand box on her lap, her bag of books beside her. She ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the box, through the paper, feeling the faint warmth that seeped through, as if the wand was still acknowledging her presence. Her parents spoke softly in the front seat, their voices low, processing. Every so often her mother would say something like, "Did you see the way the coins?" And her father would answer, "Yes, and the bank, goblins," as if saying the words helped their minds accept them. Elena listened, but her own thoughts were drifting elsewhere. September 1st, King's Cross. The wall between platforms 9 and 10 that she would have to run through like it was nothing. The Hogwarts Express. Priya's pinky promise under the street lamp. The sorting hat. An actual talking hat, Verity had said. The castle in the Scottish Highlands, rebuilt stronger than ever, full of staircases that moved and portraits that spoke, and teachers who had fought to keep children safe. She thought of her wand again. Hawthorn. Phoenix feather. A wand that could heal and could harm. A wand that had waited for her before she even existed. And she thought, with a quiet pulse of feeling she couldn't name, that this wasn't just a new school. It was a new life. They reached home late, after 8. The house looked the same as it always had. Familiar windows, familiar door, familiar porch light. Snow lay in ordinary drifts on the front garden. The air outside tasted of cold and chimney smoke. The street was quiet. Elenina stepped out of the car and for a moment felt the strange sensation of being split. Part of her still in Diagon Alley under golden lamps, part of her here under a simple porch light. Her mother unlocked the door and ushered them inside, rubbing her hands together briskly like she could shake off the day's unreality. The warmth of their house enveloped Elenina, and the familiarity of it made her throat tighten unexpectedly. She loved this place. She loved her small bedroom, her desk, her shelves of Muggle books. She loved her parents' quiet routine, the kettle, the soft hum of normal life. And yet she knew she would never see it the same way again. Her mother went straight to the kitchen to make something quick for dinner despite the late hour. Tomato soup and grilled cheese, simple comfort food that smelled like home. Her father helped Elenina carry her purchases upstairs, taking the cauldron bag with care, as if it contained glass instead of pewter. At her bedroom door, Robert hesitated. Want help unpacking? He asked. Elena shook her head. I want to do it myself, she said, and her voice was gentle but firm. Her father nodded, understanding. All right, he said softly. We'll be downstairs. He paused, then added, I'm proud of you. Elena's chest warmed. Thanks, Dad. He left, closing the door quietly behind him. Elenisa stood in her room surrounded by shopping bags and took a slow breath. Her bedroom looked smaller tonight. Not in a bad way, just as if it belonged to a version of her that had woken up this morning and believed magic was only in stories. The white walls, the posters, the shelf of books, Roald Dahl, old favorites, a few worn Harry Potter novels she'd read like they were comfort blankets. Her desk with half-finished homework from primary school, her pencil case, her school uniform hanging on the back of her chair, suddenly irrelevant. She began unpacking slowly. First, the textbooks. She placed them on her bookshelf one by one, their spines bright and strange among her familiar paperbacks. The Standard Book of Spells sat beside Matilda, and the sight made her laugh softly, not mocking, just amazed. A History of Magic towered next to a book about ancient Egypt she'd borrowed from the school library. Magical Theory slid in beside a science book her father had once given her, thinking she might like it. It looked wrong and right at the same time, like her shelf was becoming a bridge between worlds. She touched the spines lightly, feeling the weight of what they promised. Learning, responsibility, the chance to understand this magic not as a miracle but as a skill. Then, the robes. She folded them neatly into her wardrobe, black fabric that felt heavier and more real than she expected. She hung the winter cloak on a hook on the back of her door, where she could see it easily. The charcoal fabric looked almost like night, and the silver fastenings caught the light. It felt like a reminder. Hogwarts was not a fantasy. It was waiting. She placed her cauldron carefully in her closet, along with the brass scales and other supplies. It felt absurd in a way to see a pewter cauldron sitting among her shoes and old school bags, but it was hers. It belonged to her now. She set the bag of sweets from Honeydukes on her desk and smiled at the bright packaging. She placed her chocolate frog cards beside them, including the McGonagall card, still tucked carefully, and Priya's address on its crumpled paper. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the small wrapped package from Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. The basic blaze box Verity had helped her choose. Elena set it down gently, her fingers lingering on the brown paper stamped with the WW logo. She thought of Fred Weasley, of the way joy had been built into that shop like a structure. She didn't fully understand the grief of a war she hadn't lived through, but she understood enough to feel respect for the people who chose to keep the world bright anyway. Finally, she took out the wand box. The worn box looked almost too old to belong to her. A girl with a desk scattered with pens and a bedroom full of familiar things. But when she placed it on her bed and opened it, the wand inside looked entirely at home in the lamplight. Pale hawthorn. Spirals carved into the handle. Smooth and slender and quietly powerful. Alalena picked it up carefully. Warmth answered immediately. Not dramatic. Not flashy. Just the steady feeling of recognition that made her breath ease. She held it for a long time, turning it slightly in her hand, watching how the wood caught the light. She thought about trying to do something, anything, to prove to herself again that this was real. But she didn't know any spells. And even if she did, something in her felt that the wand deserved respect, that it shouldn't be waved around like a toy in her bedroom the first night she owned it. So she simply held it. She let the warmth settle into her palm like reassurance. Then she found a small wooden box in a drawer. one that had once held jewelry, and lined it with soft fabric. Carefully, she placed her wand inside, closing the lid gently. There, safe. Her mother called up the stairs then, voice soft. Dinner, love. Elenina answered and went downstairs. The kitchen smelled like tomato soup and toasted bread, and the familiarity of it made her feel steadier than any spell could. They ate together at the small table, and Elena talked, not rushing, not trying to cram every detail in, but telling them what mattered most, about Priya, about Luna, about Padma, about the one choosing her and the way it felt like coming home. Her parents listened with careful attention, trying to picture a world they couldn't enter. Their faces held wonder and worry, pride and fear, all tangled together. Every week, Margaret said again, and her voice had that anxious edge now that the excitement had faded. You'll write every week? I promise, Elena said. And she meant it. By owl. Her father shook his head with an incredulous smile. Our daughter will write letters by owl, he murmured, as if repeating it might make sense. Elelina laughed softly. I'll figure it out. After dinner, after dishes, after her parents' gentle good nights, Elelena returned to her bedroom. She stood by the window and looked out at the Lancashire night. Snow was falling outside. Ordinary snow that drifted down and settled in quiet drifts. It melted where it hit warm surfaces. It piled where it could. But Elena watched it with new eyes. She remembered Diagon Alley snow, the way it had glowed and vanished into sparkles. She remembered how it had seemed almost alive, as if even the weather there carried intention. She wondered, not in a silly way, but in a soft, curious way, whether all snow had a kind of magic if you knew how to see it, not spells and sparks, but the quiet magic of turning the world gentler, of making everything look new. She pressed her palm to the cold glass and felt the day settle over her again. The weight of it, the joy of it, the enormity of it. This morning she had been an ordinary girl with an ordinary life. Tonight she was a witch with a wand in a box on her dresser. The thought still made her chest flutter. She climbed into bed and pulled her duvet up, the familiar fabric comforting against her skin. Her room was quiet. The world outside was still. And yet her mind was full of moving staircases and enchanted books, and golden street lamps and a wand that had waited 37 years to rest in her hand. Elenina lay there, eyes open in the dark, and thought about the long wait ahead. 8 months. 8 months of ordinary school days where she would sit in classrooms and write with pens and pretend her life hadn't been rearranged. 8 months of looking at her bookshelf where spellbooks sat beside storybooks. 8 months of sleeping in this bed, knowing that soon she would sleep in a castle. 8 months of waiting for September 1st. She should have felt impatient, frantic. Instead, she felt something calm, like the wand's warmth had settled into her bones. She wasn't running away from her life. She was stepping toward it. And when sleep finally came, it came gently, carrying her into dreams that were not frightening, not loud, just full of soft light. Snow drifting through golden air, an old shop full of waiting wands, a train platform hidden in plain sight, and the steady feeling of a new beginning. The days that followed were strangely ordinary. That was what surprised Elenina most. She had half expected the world to look different when she woke up the next morning, expected the ceiling of her bedroom to be taller, or the air to shimmer, or the snow outside to fall in neat spirals and vanish into sparkles. She had expected, perhaps foolishly, that once magic had been revealed, it would keep revealing itself, like a curtain that couldn't be fully drawn again. But when she opened her eyes, her room was exactly the same. White walls, familiar posters, the small stack of schoolwork on her desk, her wardrobe door slightly ajar, the pale winter light creeping in through the curtains, like it always did on a snowy Lancashire morning. Outside, the snow fell in the plain, sensible way it always had. It was almost disappointing for a heartbeat, until she remembered the wand box on her dresser, the textbooks on her shelf, Priya's address tucked carefully beside her chocolate frog cards. The day wasn't a dream. It hadn't evaporated overnight. Magic hadn't disappeared just because the Muggle world looked the same. It had simply moved into a quieter place, into objects and knowledge and waiting, into the steady truth that she was still herself, and also not. Elenina lay still for a moment, listening to the house. Her mother moving downstairs. The kettle clicking on. The soft creak of floorboards, normal sounds, comforting sounds. And underneath that comfort, something else, a calm pulse of anticipation that sat in her chest like a second heartbeat. She got up slowly, almost reverently, as if the day had taught her that rushing meant missing things. Her feet were cold on the floor. She'd pulled on her slippers and crossed to the dresser. The small wooden jewelry box she'd found the night before sat there, neat and waiting. She opened it carefully. The hawthorn wand lay inside like it belonged there, pale wood against soft fabric. Elenina reached out and lifted it, and the warmth came immediately, a steady recognition that made her shoulders relax without her meaning to. It didn't feel dramatic this morning. It didn't make light bloom or sparks spiral. It simply felt present, like holding someone's hand in a quiet room. She held it for a moment longer, then placed it back in the box gently, closing the lid. Not because she didn't want it, but because she wanted to treat it properly, like something that deserved patience. Downstairs, her mother called her name. Elenina washed, dressed, and went down. Breakfast tasted normal too. Toast, butter, a little jam. But Elenina ate with a strange new awareness, as if even the act of sitting at the kitchen table belonged to a life that had split into before and after. Her parents were subdued this morning. Not unhappy, just thoughtful. Robert sat with his mug of tea cradled between his hands, eyes occasionally going distant as though he could still see the marble pillars of Gringotts, or the way the brick wall had folded itself aside, like something obedient. Margaret buttered her toast with careful motions, as if keeping her hands busy helped her keep her mind steady. She looked up at Elenina more often than usual, as if checking that her daughter was still here, still herself, still within reach. "Did you sleep?" Margaret asked. Elenina nodded. "Eventually." Her father's mouth twitched almost a smile. "I didn't." Margaret shot him a look, fond but tired. "Neither did I." Elenina hesitated, then said quietly, "I keep thinking it's real." Her mother's face softened. "Yes," she said, "it's real." Robert exhaled slowly. "We're going to have to get used to a lot of things," he murmured. "Letters by owl for one." Elenina smiled, and the tension eased just a little. After breakfast, her parents did what they always did: cleared plates, wiped surfaces, moved through their morning routine like people who were trying to prove to themselves that ordinary life could still hold them. Elena went upstairs again, pulled her bedroom door closed, and stood staring at her bookshelf. Her new textbooks looked almost too bright among her old paperbacks. Not just in color, but in meaning. They didn't feel like schoolbooks the way her old ones did. They felt like keys. She reached for the standard book of spells, grade 1 first, because it was the one she wanted most, the one that made her chest flutter with nervous excitement. She carried it to her bed, sat cross-legged with the duvet tucked around her legs, and opened it carefully. The pages smelled faintly of something she couldn't name, ink and parchment, yes, but also something else, something like crushed herbs warmed between fingers. The print was clear, the diagrams neat. The first chapter was gentle, almost welcoming. It didn't start with dangerous things. It started with basics. How to hold your wand, how to stand properly, how to pronounce words with care. Elena read slowly, lips moving silently as she traced the syllables. She practiced the wand grip in the air with her empty hand, as if training her fingers to remember what her wand would eventually require. She stood by the mirror and tried the posture described: feet planted, shoulders relaxed, wrist steady. It felt slightly silly to rehearse without the wand, but it also felt right. She wasn't just daydreaming. She was preparing. At one point, she glanced toward the small jewelry box on her dresser and felt the urge to take the wand out and try. Just once, she thought, just to see if anything happens. But she didn't. Not because she was frightened of explosions or broken vases, though Ollivander's shop had been enough to warn her that magic could misbehave. She didn't, because the book had been very clear about one thing: intention mattered. Focus mattered. Respect mattered. And Elena wanted her first spell to be something she learned properly, something she could do without guessing. So she read instead, letting the information settle into her mind like snow settling into quiet corners. She read about wand woods, briefly, not in full detail, but enough to make her think again of Hawthorne. Healing and harm. Contradiction, depth. She read about the way spells were shaped not only by the words but by the movement, the precise angle of wrist and arm, the clarity of thought behind it. She read until she reached the first simple spell listed for practice in class, and then she closed the book, not because she was bored, but because she felt full, like a cup that needed time before it could take more. She went to her desk and wrote Priya a letter. Not a now letter, not yet, just a letter on plain paper, written in careful handwriting, with a pen that suddenly felt slightly outdated, but still comforting. Dear Priya, I got home safe. I can't believe yesterday was real. My wand is hawthorn and phoenix feather, and it still feels strange to write that like it's normal. Death? I keep thinking about Hogwarts, and the sorting and the train. Thank you for meeting me again at the end. It made leaving feel easier. I'm still scared, but I'm also excited, and I think maybe those two things will just live together for a while. Write back if you can. I don't know how owls work yet, but I'm going to figure it out. If not, I'll post this the normal way for now. From Elena, she folded it, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote Priya's Birmingham address on the front with care. It felt oddly grounding, this small, familiar action in the midst of magic. Friendship still worked the same way, she thought. Even in a world of spells and wands, you still reached out to someone and said, I'm here. Are you there? Downstairs, her mother called her again, this time to help with some chores. Elena went down and peeled vegetables, wiped counters, moved through the morning like she always had, except now every normal action felt like it belonged to someone with a secret. By lunchtime, the snow outside had thickened. The garden looked softer, the world muffled. Elena stood at the window for a long time, watching the flakes drift down. In her mind, she could still see Diagon Alley's snow dancing in purposeful loops. But this snow was lovely too, in its own way. It didn't glow. It didn't whisper her name. It simply fell, quiet and steady, transforming everything without asking permission. Her father appeared beside her and looked out as well. What are you thinking? He asked gently. Ayelena hesitated. I keep thinking about September, she admitted, and how long it is. 8 months feels enormous. Her father nodded slowly. It is a long time, he agreed. But it also means we have time. Elena turned to him. Time for what? Her father smiled faintly. For you to be excited without being rushed. For us to learn what we need to learn, for us to figure out the owl thing, and the train, and all of it.
Elena's chest eased slightly.
I want to be ready, she said. You will be, Robert said, and there was quiet certainty in his voice. You're already taking it seriously. Eliana glanced toward the stairs, toward her room, toward the wand box waiting upstairs. What if I'm not good at magic? She asked, voicing the fear again because saying it out loud seemed to make it smaller. What if I can't do the spells? Her father's eyebrows lifted gently. You've been good at learning your whole life, he said. Magic might be new, but learning isn't. Elena gave a small, reluctant smile. But what if it's different? It will be, her father agreed. But you won't be doing it alone. You'll have teachers, friends, and you'll have us in the way we can help. Elena leaned against his arm briefly, comforted. That afternoon, her mother drove them into town to post a few things and buy groceries. It should have felt like any other trip, but Elena watched everything with altered eyes. People in winter coats, cars throwing up slush, the supermarket shelves. Normality looked almost delicate, like a world built on the assumption that magic didn't exist. When they stood in the post office, Elena slid Priya's letter across the counter and watched the clerk stamp it and place it in a bin like it was nothing special. Elena felt a strange tug of impatience. This letter would travel slowly. It would take days. And in the magical world, she had been told, letters arrived by owl as if distance were a minor inconvenience. But she reminded herself again. She had time. She would learn. Back home, she returned to her books. She opened Magical Theory next, and the writing was denser, more serious. It wasn't just instructions, it was explanation. An attempt to describe the shape of magic, the principles behind it, the ethics woven through it like hidden thread. Elena read about intention, about control, about the way emotion could influence spells if not handled properly. Some parts made her frown, not because she couldn't understand them, but because they made her aware of how heavy magic could be if you didn't respect it. There were lines that spoke, in careful academic language, of responsibility, of restraint, of knowing not only what you could do, but what you should do. Alianina thought of Ollivander's pale eyes and his cold grip on her wrist. Trust it when the moment comes. She didn't like how those words curled in her mind. She wanted her first year to be simple. Classes, friends, discovery, laughter, the ordinary joys of school life. But she also knew now that the magical world had teeth. It could smile and still be dangerous. And yet everyone she'd met in Diagon Alley had not treated that danger like a reason to hide. They treated it like a reason to be prepared, to be kind, to be brave in quiet ways. Elenina closed the book and stared at the ceiling. She thought about Priya, worried but determined. She thought about Verity, smiling in a shop built on joy that had been chosen deliberately. She thought about Padma, speaking with fierce respect for teachers who had protected children. She thought about Luna's calm certainty. It's already waiting. And she thought about her own wand, hawthorn and phoenix feather, a wand that had waited decades in a box. What did it mean really for something to wait? It meant patience. It meant belief. It meant certainty that a meeting would happen even if you didn't know when. Elenella realized slowly that the waiting ahead, the 8 months, was not an obstacle. It was part of the story, a bridge between who she had been and who she would be. That evening, she went downstairs with her wand box in her hands. Her parents looked up immediately, alert. I just wanted to. Elelina stopped, suddenly shy. I wanted to show it to you properly, not outside in the snow. Here. Her mother's eyes softened. Of course, love. Elena sat at the table and placed the box down carefully, then opened it. The kitchen light fell across the wand, and the pale wood looked warmer here than it had in Ollivanders. Less mysterious, more hers. Her mother leaned in, but didn't touch. Her father watched with the careful focus he had used all day in Diagon Alley, as though he could learn something simply by looking properly. Elenina lifted the wand. Warmth flowed into her palm, immediate and steady. Her mother's breath caught. It's beautiful, Margaret whispered, and her voice held pride and fear braided together. Elena nodded, because she didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. Her father cleared his throat quietly. Does it do anything? He asked, not skeptical, just curious. Elena held the wand still. It did, she said softly. In the shop. It made light, but I don't know any spells. And I don't want to guess. Her mother's face softened further. That's sensible, she said, and for the first time in days, Elena saw relief rather than worry. I'm glad you're not going to wave it around. Elenina smiled faintly. Me too. She placed the wand back in the box and closed it. Then, after a moment, she said quietly, I'm scared. Her father's face shifted, attentive. About leaving? Elenina nodded. Not just leaving. I mean,
Yeah.
was. If Hogwarts changes me so much that I don't fit here anymore. Margaret's hand reached across the table and covered Elenina's fingers. Warm, steady, familiar. You'll always fit here, she said firmly. This is your home. Elenina's throat tightened. But what if I come back and everything feels small? Her father was quiet for a moment, and he said gently, Then we'll make room for the bigger version of you. Elenina blinked, surprised. Robert's expression was soft. People grow, he said. They grow from school, from experiences, from things that make them see the world differently. Magic is unusual, yes. But growing isn't unusual. We'll grow with you where we can. Elenina felt something loosen in her chest. Her mother squeezed her hand. And, Margaret added, voice calmer now, we'll be proud of you, even if we don't understand every bit of it. Elena stared at them both, and suddenly the fear of stepping into a world her parents couldn't follow felt a little less sharp. They couldn't come to Hogwarts. They couldn't stand in her classrooms or sit in her common room, but they could still be her anchor. That night, Elenina went to bed with a different kind of calm. She still thought about September. She still felt the ache of waiting, but she also felt held. The next weeks began to settle into a rhythm. School days in the Muggle world continued, but Elenina's mind carried an undercurrent of secret preparation. She read her textbooks in the evenings, taking notes like a proper student, even though no one had assigned her homework yet. She practiced pronunciation quietly in her room, not casting spells, just shaping the words carefully so her mouth wouldn't stumble later. She wrote another letter to Priya when a reply arrived. Priya's handwriting excited and looping, full of questions and fear and determination. They began, slowly, to build friendship across distance, one envelope at a time. Elenina's parents learned too. They read the information leaflet the ministry guide had given them. They asked questions. They wrote down important dates. They spoke, sometimes, in low voices when they thought Elenina wasn't listening, worry surfacing in the quiet moments, like something that had nowhere else to go. But they didn't hide it from her completely. One night, Margaret admitted softly, I'm afraid, sometimes. Elelena had swallowed and answered honestly, "Me too." And in that shared honesty, something steadied. Winter deepened. Christmas approached. Elelena's world became a strange blend. School assemblies about holiday break and carols, and at home, magical books on her shelf, her wand box safe in its little wooden case, her mind full of Hogwarts. Sometimes she stood at the window and watched snow fall and wondered if somewhere in London, Diagon Alley's snow was falling too, dancing in spirals under golden lamps. Sometimes she touched the wand box and felt warmth through the lid, like a quiet reminder. I'm here. And gradually, without Elena noticing the exact moment it happened, the idea of Hogwarts stopped being only overwhelming. It became real. In a softer way, not a towering, impossible castle in her imagination, but a place she would actually go, a train she would actually board, a door she would actually walk through, a life she would actually live. By the time December nights grew long and quiet, and the house felt snug against the cold, Elelena had stopped thinking of magic as something that happened only in Diagon Alley. Magic, she realized, was also in waiting, in learning, in writing letters to a girl you'd met beneath a street lamp, and trusting that friendship could hold, in looking at your parents and knowing they were frightened too, and still choosing to step forward. And one evening, as she sat at her desk with a book open and a pen in her hand, Elelena felt a calm certainty settle over her. September would come. She didn't have to force it. She only had to keep becoming ready. The end of December arrived not with a dramatic announcement, but with the slow deepening of winter, the kind that settled into the bones of the world and asked nothing of anyone except patience. Lancashire turned white, and then grey, and then white again, as the snow came and went in soft waves. Mornings were dim, afternoons barely brightened. Nights seemed to stretch long and thoughtful, the windows dark mirrors that reflected Elena's room back at her desk, her books, the shape of her own face when she leaned close enough to see her breath fog the glass. At school, everything continued exactly as it always had. Timetables, lunch queues, teachers who spoke too quickly, and students who complained about homework, as if homework were the largest problem a person could have. Elelena moved through it, like someone holding a secret in both hands. Not in a triumphant way, not with arrogance, with a kind of quiet care, as if the secret might bruise if she gripped it too tightly. She sat in lessons and copied notes. She answered questions. She laughed when her friends made jokes, and she listened when people argued over trivial things that suddenly seemed far away from her real life. But she didn't resent the ordinary world. If anything, she began to see its gentleness more clearly. There was comfort in routine, comfort in knowing what happened next, comfort in the predictable rhythm of days that didn't contain ancient wand makers or hidden streets, or the weight of a destiny implied by an old man's pale eyes. Elena realized something then. Ordinary life wasn't less meaningful. It was simply quieter, and quietness had its own strength. At home, her room had changed. Not in the way her walls looked, or the way her shelves were arranged, but in what the room meant. It had become a place where two worlds could exist at once. Her muggle books sat beside her magical textbooks. Her school bag sat beside a canvas bag that held a pewter cauldron she didn't yet know how to use. Her winter cloak, charmed to keep her warm in the Highlands, hung by the door like a shadow that promised future weather, future landscapes, future versions of herself. And in the small wooden box, lined with fabric on her dresser, her wand waited. Some evenings Elelena took it out and simply held it, not to practice, not to test it, just to feel its warmth settle into her palm and remind her that the day in London had not been a dream. It was strange how quickly a person could become used to something. In the first days after Diagon Alley, After the hidden street, after the wand, after everything, Elenina had thought she would never stop feeling astonished. She had thought the wonder would stay sharp, like the first cut of cold air when you step outside. But wonder, she learned, could soften without disappearing. It could become woven into you, part of your ordinary. It could sit quietly in the background and still be real. Her letters with Priya became a steady thread. Priya wrote about her own reading, about how she tried to memorize the names of spells, and then gotten overwhelmed and had to stop. Priya wrote about how her parents kept asking questions they couldn't answer, and how sometimes she felt guilty for being excited when her mother looked afraid. Elena wrote back honestly. She told Priya she was afraid too. She told Priya about the way her parents tried so hard not to let their fear turn into distance, and how that effort made Elena love them even more. She told Priya about the books she liked best, the chapters that made her feel steadier, the pages that made her feel heavy. She didn't mention everything. She didn't mention the way the wand had been waiting decades. She didn't mention the old wand maker's warning. She didn't mention the particular uneasy feeling that sometimes surfaced in quiet moments, the sense that something ahead would ask something of her, not because she didn't trust Priya, because she didn't yet understand it herself, and she didn't want to put a shape to something that was still shapeless. But Priya didn't need that to be her friend. Priya needed the simple truth: you're not alone. I'm here too. And that truth traveled well, even by ordinary post. Christmas came. It arrived with small rituals: the tree in the living room, her father grumbling as he untangled lights, her mother insisting the baubles had to be placed evenly. It arrived with familiar smells from the kitchen and familiar films on the television, and the way the whole house seemed to grow softer, as if holiday time changed the air. Elena's parents kept Christmas quieter than usual. Not joyless, just thoughtful. They still bought her presents, still wrapped them, still smiled when she opened them. But Elena could see how their minds drifted, how their eyes sometimes went distant, as if part of them was still standing in a hidden street under golden lamps, watching snow do impossible things. On Christmas morning, after presents, her mother said gently, "Would you like to show your grandparents anything?" Elena froze. Her grandparents didn't know. No one in their family knew. The ministry guide had explained it carefully. Secrecy was important. The magical world stayed hidden for reasons that had been written into laws older than their house, older than their town, older than most people's ideas of history. Elena swallowed. "I can't," she said softly. Her mother nodded. "I know." There was no accusation in her voice. Only sadness. Not because she wanted to break rules, but because she could feel, already, the shape of what would change in Elena's life. The way certain truths would no longer be shareable, the way some family members would remain outside the circle no matter how much love existed. Elena reached for her mother's hand under the table and squeezed it. "But I can still be me," she whispered, as if saying it out loud would keep it true. Her mother squeezed back. "Yes," she said, and her eyes shone slightly. "You can." That evening, when the house was quiet and the tree lights reflected softly in the window, Elenina sat on the floor in her room and wrote Priya another letter. She wrote about Christmas and feeling strange, like she was holding a part of herself behind her teeth. And Priya, in her reply, wrote something that made Elena stare at the paper for a long time. She wrote, "Sometimes I feel like the magical world is so big it will swallow the other one. But then I remember we're the bridge. We're both. We're allowed to be both." Elena read that sentence again and again until it stopped being just words and became something she could rest against. The bridge. Yes, that was what she was. That was what Priya was. That was what Muggle-born witches and wizards had always been, even if No one said it out loud. They belonged to two worlds, and their lives would be the place those worlds touched. January came next. Winter deepened again. The new year arrived with fireworks on television and neighbors cheering in the street. And Elelina stood at her bedroom window watching the ordinary celebration and thinking about the other kind of fireworks she'd seen in the prank shop. Little dragons of sparks inside a glass case, joy deliberately contained so it couldn't harm anyone. She wondered, quietly, what celebration looked like at the magical school in the Highlands. Did they have trees? Did they sing? Did they exchange gifts? Did the castle feel warm against the snow? She didn't know yet. But the not knowing no longer felt like a void. It felt like a promise. In the weeks that followed, something subtle changed inside her. Her fear didn't disappear, but it stopped being the loudest thing. Elelina learned to carry it the way you carried a heavy book bag. You adjusted your posture. You took breaks. You accepted the weight as part of the journey, rather than a sign you were failing. She began to picture September not as a cliff edge, but as a door she would walk through. She began to plan, small and practical, the way her father would. She made a list of what she needed to do before September. Learn how Owl Post worked. Practice neat handwriting for magical ink. Find out if the castle had anything like a uniform inspection. Make sure her winter cloak still fit by the time she was 11 3/4 instead of 11. Her mother helped her with those lists. Not because her mother knew the magical world, but because her mother knew how to prepare for something unknown. Her father helped too, in his own way, researching train routes to London, marking calendars, asking careful questions about safety and travel, and what they should do if there was an emergency. He couldn't solve the magical world like an engineering problem, but he could still solve the parts that were solvable. And in that, Elelena felt loved. One evening in late January, snow fell again. Elenina stood at the window and watched it drift down. The street lamp outside cast the flakes into pale gold. For a moment, just a moment, Elenina imagined they were the magical kind, looping and spiraling, whispering, vanishing into sparkles. But they were ordinary. They landed and stayed, and Elelena found she could love that too. She turned away from the window and crossed to her dresser. She opened the small wooden box and lifted her wand out. Warmth answered immediately, steady and calm. Elenina held it loosely, not gripping, not fearing it, just holding. She thought about the hidden street in London, the day of discovery, the faces she'd met, the friendly shop assistant who had welcomed her, the older student who had spoken of houses and belonging, the wand maker who had looked at her as if he could see a story she hadn't yet read. Elenina didn't know what story she was meant to have. She didn't know what her wand expected, but she knew something else now, something that settled inside her like a quiet vow. Whatever came, she wanted to be the kind of person who didn't turn away, the kind who learned, the kind who stood beside others, the kind who carried both worlds in her hands and treated them with care. She lowered the wand and placed it back in its box gently. Then she sat at her desk, took out a sheet of paper, and began writing again. Not a letter this time, but notes. Careful and neat. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote, "Things I want to remember." And beneath that, she wrote in a steady hand, "The snow in the hidden street didn't melt. It turned into light." The prank shop was bright, even when it carried grief. A friend can feel like an anchor. A wand can feel like home. Fear and excitement can live together. I am the bridge. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and stared at the page. It looked simple. It was simple. But it felt like truth. Elenina folded the paper and tucked it into a notebook she planned to take with her to school, her magical school, when the time came. Then she climbed into bed. Outside, snow continued to fall, quiet and steady. Inside, her house was warm. Eliana lay still in the dark and let her mind drift. She didn't force it towards September. She didn't try to leap forward. She simply held the image of a door waiting to open. And when sleep came, it came gently, carrying her into dreams that were calm and bright, not of battles or warnings, but of movement and learning and belonging. A train, a castle, a hall full of candlelight. A voice calling her name, not with fear, but with welcome. And in the quiet space between waking life and dreams, Elena felt the steady warmth of certainty. September would come. She would go. She would become who she was meant to be, and she would not lose herself in the becoming.